Today we're discussing 3 National Park cold case mysteries. Let's get into it. Number 1. Armand B Johnson. On April 13, 2005, a passerby stumbled upon a gruesome discovery in an otherwise beautiful and scenic location. At the southern edge of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, near Kahuku Ranch, lay the body of 44-year-old Armand B Johnson. He was discovered wearing a tank top, shorts, socks, and slippers, and was about 100 yards off the Mamahoa Highway. Investigators determined that he had been killed by a single gunshot to the back of the neck, and that he likely died in the same spot his body was found. There was no evidence to suggest that his body had been moved, nor any effort to conceal the body. In the 17 years since his murder, Armand's killer has never been found, and the motive for the crimes has not been determined. His vehicle, which was described as an old beater, was never found. Still, Armand's friends do have some opinions about it. They called his death an execution. Some of them knew that he used drugs recreationally and wondered if that might have had something to do with his murder. Still, they don't feel that drugs alone would explain what had happened to him, especially considering he was known and loved by so many on the island. Everybody loved him, retired Police Sergeant Samson Wana said in a statement to the media. He could meet you today, and you would end up liking him. Armand had relocated to the Big Island from Seattle, Washington in 1984, where he worked as a massage therapist and hosted a reggae music show on a local radio station. He also worked as an aide to autistic children. His friends recalled his loud, boisterous voice that could be heard across a room and his easily likable personality. He was last seen 2 days before his body was discovered. He had been seen leaving work and told a coworker he was headed home, but he never made it there. His friends described him as a harmless man that was very trusting. In 2015, 10 years after the murder, all leads eventually went cold. The FBI announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Armand Johnson's killer, in hope that the passage of time and a monetary reward would embolden a witness to come forward. 7 years later, neither an arrest or conviction has occurred. The Honolulu FBI is still looking for tips that would solve this mystery and bring Armand's killer to justice. The FBI is still looking for tips that will solve this mystery and bring Armand's killer to justice. FBI Special Agent in Charge Paul D. Delacourt said, "A decade has passed since the murder of Armand Johnson. We're hoping that the passage of time may embolden a witness to come forward and tell us the truth about how and why this tragic act of violence occurred." Number 2. Julianne Williams and Lolly Winans. On May 19, 1996, 24-year-old Julianne Julie Williams and 26-year-old Laura Lolly Winans were a young couple with a passion for the outdoors, embarking on their latest hike together in the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Julie and Lolly were both experienced hikers and skilled outdoor guides, having been on dozens of similar hikes. They had even led victims of sexual assaults on hiking and camping trips as a therapeutic experience. About 2 weeks after they left for their hike, family and friends had not heard from them and realized they had not returned from their hiking trip on the date they had planned to. The family reported Julie and Lolly missing to park authorities, who began their search on Bridle Trail, a lesser-used trail in the Shenandoah National Park, where the women had told family they would be hiking. Then, on June 1st, loved ones received the worst news imaginable when Julie and Lolly's bodies were found by park rangers at their campsite, wrapped in sleeping bags. According to media reports from the time, they had been tied up and their throats had been cut. Lolly's golden retriever, Taj, who had been hiking with them, was located wandering the trail.
Correct. Oh, you're not going to spend the night here?
No.
Hundreds of tips came into the FBI in the aftermath of the murders, and they soon landed on a suspect. However, it wasn't until 2002 when Attorney General John Ashcroft announced in a press conference that 34-year-old Daryl David Reyes, who had already been in jail for another assault in the same park, had been indicted for Julie and Lolly's murders. Ashcroft labeled their deaths as a hate crime, since Julie and Lolly were a same-sex couple, and Reyes apparently despised LGBTQ+ people. Unfortunately, the DNA testing proved inconclusive, and the evidence linking Reyes to the crimes was purely circumstantial. Phone records had shown he had called a California support group for LGBTQ+ people, which Julie had written about in her diaries. The connection sparked the idea that the two women had been stalked and targeted by Reyes. Without any forensic evidence placing Reyes at the crime scene, the Department of Justice ended up dismissing the case, and he never went to trial for the murders. More than a quarter-century later, Julie and Lolly's killers have not been brought to justice, and their murders remain unsolved. Their case has been covered in countless podcasts, articles, and even in a successful book. Author Catherine Miles covered the Shenandoah National Park cold cases in her book titled Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. She retraced the young women's steps and took a deep dive into the evidence and the initial investigation. She believes another man, Richard Mark Ivanovitz, who was a serial killer. Ivanovitz killed himself in 2002, right before he was arrested in another crime. About 5 years ago, the FBI renewed its public outreach in search of tips and leads to help solve the case. Because the park is visited by people from all over, those who were nearby at the time of the murders could be from anywhere in the country or world. Those who may have information have been asked to call the FBI.
It's been over 20 years since St. Cloud native Julie Williams and Lolly Winans of Unity, Maine, were found murdered in the Virginia park. The FBI is still looking for tips to find who's responsible.
We're using this opportunity, the 20-year anniversary, to let folks know that the case is still a pending FBI investigation, and we are looking for leads. We're looking for new evidence.
There's somebody that knows something, and hopefully some relationship will change, and somebody out there will feel the guilt or come forward to do the right thing.
Julie and Lolly were last seen alive on May 24th, 1996, hiking with their dog at Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. Julie was born and raised in St. Cloud and graduated from Cathedral High School in 1990.
This is a case that was enormously emotional for our region and, frankly, for my agents and for this office. The folks that are assigned to it now were assigned to it decades ago.
Julie had a passion for the outdoors, sports, and social justice. She and her best high school friend Becky won the state doubles title for Cathedral in tennis their senior year. Her friends, teachers, and family to this day say the horrific double murder is something they will never forget.
This isn't the St. Cloud world that we all knew. This terrible thing had happened in a distant place, and it brought us a dose of the world that we just couldn't relate to.
We did get together once when we were both in college, and of course it was always good to see her, but yeah, when I finally got that news, I of course was devastated that we hadn't seen each other more throughout those years after high school.
Her father, Tom, says Julie got along with just about everyone and usually cared for others above herself.
Yeah, she did with everybody. It's been a lot of years, of course, and you hold on to the memories.
No one has been exonerated in this case, and so our aperture is wide open. We are looking at anyone that had any relationship to the events on the Shenandoah 20 years ago that took the lives of these two ladies.
Before the charges were dropped, prosecutors said that Reyes targeted Williams and Winans because of his hate of women and homosexuals. The FBI won't comment on specific suspects now, but the case is still being investigated as a hate crime.
There's certainly some indication that they were targeted sort of pursuant to a hatred of their lifestyle or their choices. And that is something that was certainly covered in that press conference, and I think that's certainly how we still scope the case.
After hearing the horrible news, Tom visited the site where his daughter was killed. He says it was a beautiful area out east and that the tragedy tainted a tranquil scene.
Part of that, I did want to see, it was important to me to see where she died. And so, you know, I was in the park, stayed in the park, and one of the cabins there, and had access to all of the people in the park that knew Julie and that also knew her story. A beautiful little area down by a stream, and that's where she died.
Over 20 years later, Tom says he still hopes answers and closure are found. He also hopes the community will continue to talk about the good memories that Julie left behind.
To talk to people, to say, you know, just that I remember this story about Julie, or boy, Julie would have laughed at that. I think being in touch with the people who have had a loss is very important. They certainly don't forget.
Number 3. Bobby Bizup. Located in the Rocky Mountains National Park just outside Allenspark, Colorado, Camp St. Malo was an all-boys Catholic summer camp established in the 1930s. It later became co-ed in the 1970s before being converted to a retreat space in the 1980s. Eventually, the scenic chapel and grounds became a popular wedding venue, with sweeping views of the Rocky Mountains. But this beautiful place has a dark history associated with it. On August 15, 1958, at Camp St. Malo, a 10-year-old camper named Bobby Bizup disappeared. This was especially troubling to the staff and his parents because Bobby was born almost completely deaf. According to statements from the priests running the camp, Bobby had been fishing and had failed to follow a counselor and other boys back to the main lodge for dinner. A search party went out that night, and within days, hundreds of people, aided by bloodhounds and aircrafts, were in the woods looking for the boy. Bobby was not found as quickly as had been hoped. It was assumed that Bobby must have wandered off. Because he couldn't hear anyone calling or looking for him, he continued wandering in the wrong direction and got lost. In the days and weeks that followed, hope that Bobby was still alive seemed less and less possible. When they did find him, it would only be his bones, as Bobby's remains were not located for over a year. His remains were discovered on the east face of Mount Meeker, which was some distance from the camp. The initial coroner's report classified Bobby's death as an accident and determined he had likely died from exhaustion and exposure. This is what his family believed for 60 years. Both of his parents would die believing their only son's death was nothing more than a tragic accident. It was only decades and decades later that this original assumption would come into question. Not because of any new forensic evidence, but because of new information that little by little began to come out about the camp in the years that followed. It was uncovered that 3 of the seminarians at the camp had been accused of sexually assaulting multiple young boys, with 2 of them, Harold Robert White and Neil Hewitt, were described as serial child abusers. White molested at least 70 children in his 2 decades as a priest, and Hewitt was accused of molesting at least 9. Hewitt was the last person to see Bobby alive, and also the person who later found his remains a year after his disappearance. Hewitt insists that he did not harm Bobby, and White died in 2006, long before the investigation was opened. A third priest, Jerry Repola, also deceased, had only one known incident of sexual assault, but was frequently moved around different parishes, leading investigators to wonder if he had other victims and was being protected by the church. Though none of these men were known murderers, the presence of all of them at the camp when Bobby went missing necessitated a criminal investigation be opened to look into it further. So in 2020, the National Park Services opened an investigation into Bobby's death over 60 years after his body was found. While new information regarding the investigation has not yet been released, and it is made much more difficult by the fact that many of those involved have since died, the police continue to seek out new leads that will help them identify Bobby's killer. They are asking anyone who's willing to come forward who may have information, anyone who tended the camp with Bobby, to call the National Park Service. Roger Lee Ellis. In 2004, skeletal remains were found in a remote area of Montana. Investigators later found the femur and the pelvic bone. The skull showed evidence of a gunshot wound indicating that it wasn't an accidental death, and this was likely a murder victim. The victim's DNA was uploaded to national databases, but it never turned up any hits. In 2022, they decided to try genetic genealogy to identify the remains, and they revealed that they have identified the man as Roger Lee Ellis of Wisconsin. The 22-year-old faced legal issues in 1976 for the possession of cannabis. According to his family, he didn't want to go to jail and fled the state to go to California. After he left, his family never heard from him again. Law enforcement will attempt to investigate his murder, however, they recognize that solving this cold case will be incredibly challenging. They're asking anyone who knew Ellis to reach out to the Montana Cold Case Unit. Number 1. Lena Reyes Gidis. On April 20th, 1998, a couple was hiking in Maidenwater Spring when they came across something on Highway 276 in Garfield County, Utah. They found a body, and both Park Services and the Garfield County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene. They found a woman wrapped in plastic bags, duct taped, put in a blue sleeping bag, then rolled in a carpet tied with rope. Authorities believed she had been strategically placed to be found. During the autopsy, she was determined to have been between 32 and 45 years old, with brown hair and brown eyes. She weighed approximately 110 pounds. She had been shot in the back of the head execution style, and the killer had removed the tips of the fingers post-mortem. It was also noted that the body had frozen due to the below-freezing temperatures the day before the body had been found. Authorities had not been able to identify the victim. She would be called Maidenwater victim Jane Doe, and the case would go cold. The case would eventually be handed to the Utah State Bureau of Investigation. Utah Bureau agent Brian Davies did a press conference in 2018 trying to identify the Maidenwater Jane Doe. In October 2018, the Utah Department of Public Safety released a press conference asking for help identifying the victim. This press release also stated that they had considered serial killer Scott Kimball as a suspect and had yet to rule him out. This case had similarities to Kimball's other victims, but he denied involvement. Unknown to the Utah authorities, but around the same time as this press release, Ohio authorities were updating pictures of their missing persons database. A California true crime enthusiast saw the pictures of the missing person database and felt the connection to photos that had been released of the Maidenwater victim. He got in contact with Davies, saying that he should look into this missing person case. They reviewed both cases, and both Davies and the Ohio authorities confirmed that they looked very similar and had a similar mole. They believed they might have found the victim's identity and had two family members come up and take DNA tests. In a November 28 press release 20 years after the body was found, the Utah DPS confirmed the victim as missing 37-year-old Lena Reyes Gidis. Lena had gone missing in 1998. When she left for a trip from her home with her husband, Edward Gidis, to visit family in Mexico. She was supposed to travel through a Texas airport, but there was no record of her ever getting on any flights that day. She was reported missing 5 months later by her husband. Lena was a ballerina when she first met her husband in New Mexico, and they got married in '96 and moved to Youngstown, Ohio 6 months later. Now that they had identified Lena, they kept working on who her killer might be. Davis started looking back at the evidence, specifically at the rope she'd been tied in. With advances in DNA, they could use a technology that allowed them to extract DNA from a difficult surface, like a rope. They did find 2 male samples of DNA. One was ruled out as the knot expert they had used previously to see if a special knot had been used. The other sample made them look back at Lena's husband, Edward. In 1998, Lena's husband had been the primary suspect during her disappearance, because it had taken so long for her to be reported missing. He was brought in for questioning with law enforcement in October of '98, where he talked about a blue sleeping bag she was bringing as a gift, the last time he had seen her dropping her off at the airport, saying he didn't go in with her, and that she was planning on paying for the reserved ticket in cash.
The morning, Wednesday morning, April 8th.
When she made the reservations from Pittsburgh, she made it from the house, she called?
Yeah.
Do you know what flight company, what plane?
I thought it was a U.S. Air flight that I gave you.
U.S. Air. Now, at that point, she made the reservations. Did she pay for the ticket? How did she pay
She
for
was
the
going to pay
ticket?
cash for the ticket at the airport.
No, okay, so you make reservations and then you
Yeah,
pay
I told her to
cash.
take credit card, and she
But
would
she
take the
would.
credit card.
Unfortunately, Edward took his own life in 2001. Davies could not get a sample as he had been cremated after his death. Authorities then reached out to his living relatives asking for DNA samples. 2 came forward willingly and 1 had to get a search warrant. The DNA came back as a familial match. In June of 2022, law enforcement announced that the case was closed and that they had discovered Lena's killer, her husband, Edward Gidis. After 20 years, she got her name back, and after 24 years, her family got to know what happened and who killed her. In a January 2019 press release, Lena's sister is quoted saying, "I'm very grateful for all your work. I felt like for 20 years no one would listen to me, but now I know what happened. I'm here to bring her home, not like I expected, but I'm bringing her back home with me." Number 2. Benny Scruggs. On July 17, 1985 at 3 a.m., a man called 911 from a trailer home on Travis Drive in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, saying that his neighbor had been stabbed. He was still alive, but was bleeding heavily. The 911 dispatcher told him that they should put pressure on the wound and help was on the way. During the phone call, the neighbor said that the wife of the man who'd been stabbed had called him and asked for him to come over there quickly. He told the dispatcher that he was holding a knife. The dispatcher said to put it down. This was when the dispatcher could hear a female voice saying, "One of my knives is missing," and the man told the woman, "Hey Yvonne, go back there and apply pressure." When the Wisconsin Rapids police arrived, they found a man identified by the wife as Benny Scruggs on a waterbed of the trailer home covered in blood with a towel over the wound. When the ambulance arrived, the man was pronounced deceased at the scene. Benny Scruggs was 28 years old. He married Yvonne Koshaw on May 15, 1982, and they had one son together named Matthew. He worked as a baker at the Foodland East. An autopsy was performed with the cause of death being a single stab wound to the chest on the upper left-hand side. The wound had gone through his rib, into his lung, and almost out the back. The medical examiner was quoted as saying, "One hell of a big knife, like a butcher knife, and another 3/4 of an inch, and there would have been a hole in the waterbed." Police at the time interviewed surrounding neighbors, Yvonne, and the Scruggs' babysitter. The couple had been out the night before, and the babysitter had reported that they came home in better spirits than average around 1 a.m. On the other hand, during her 3 interviews that evening, Yvonne would give different versions of what had happened. During her first interview with detectives, Yvonne said that the babysitter had left, then she and Benny went to bed, him falling asleep right away, and her lying awake. Then their 2-year-old son was crying. She went to his room for about 10 minutes before feeling something was off. When she went back to bed, she noticed a shovel was up against the fridge and the trailer door was open. That was strange because she always had a habit of locking the door. She then went to look for Benny and found him covered in blood. She then called the neighbor for help. In a second interview, only a few hours after the first, she said that they both fell asleep after the babysitter left and that their 2-year-old came into their bedroom crying. She then took the toddler to his bedroom for about 10 minutes, and then noticed the shovel and the open back door on the way back. I checked in on Benny and then called the neighbor for help. During the second interview, Yvonne had stepped away for a moment. A detective overheard her talking to her friend, with her stating, "I was asleep next to him, he got stabbed, I don't know." During her final interview, she had said that they both fell asleep. She woke up to her 2-year-old crying and Benny throwing up. She took her son to his room and then went back to Benny. He was covered in blood and she called the neighbor. Detectives at the time believed that she was being uncooperative with their investigation. Police decided to drain a nearby pond in hopes of finding the missing murder weapon, but they did not find it in the pond. The alleged knife that Yvonne claimed was missing from the home was never found. Over the next few weeks, the authorities would interview neighbors, including Donald Meyer, who lived in a trailer just down the way with a woman and her child. Meyer would tell authorities that he'd previously had a sexual relationship with Yvonne when they worked together 4 or 5 years earlier. He also told police that Yvonne had a temper and that she probably killed her husband. He would continue to tell the police that he had not seen Yvonne again till the February of 1985, and that was about a week before Benny was stabbed. Yvonne had invited him over, Benny was not home, and they had sexual intercourse in the living room. And it was then that Yvonne had told him that if he wanted her, he knew how to get rid of Benny. Yvonne, in an August 1985 police interview, would confirm the sexual relationship with Meyer, saying that she didn't tell the police because she didn't think it was important, and that she was embarrassed to tell anyone. She did, however, deny saying anything about getting rid of Benny. After 1993, the case would go dormant until 2012. At that time, Donald Meyer would stack up a lengthy criminal history, and Yvonne would go on to get remarried. Donald Meyer was on trial for 10 counts of stalking jurors who had convicted him in a 2006 trial for threatening a judge. Knowing this would mean adding time to his sentence, he reached out to the Wisconsin Police Department and asked to speak to someone about Benny Scruggs' murder. In this interview, Meyer would implicate Yvonne, saying that she was trying to set him up for Benny's murder. He would also go on to say that he'd been over multiple times, and that one time she took him into the bedroom so his fingerprints would be there. He also drew an intricate diagram of the trailer and knew facts about it, like the bedroom door would open and the trailer's back door was screwed shut. After this interview, detectives would interview other people who were around at the time of the murder. Some will remember talking to Yvonne about the murder in the following weeks or years. One witness said Yvonne had told them that she knew who killed Benny. And another said Yvonne had asked if she thought she had killed him, the witness asking, "Well, did you?" And Yvonne never answered. Another witness came forward after seeing an article in a newspaper in 2013 about Benny Scruggs' murder, saying her son had dated Yvonne between 1989 and 1990 while she was married to her new husband, who is now deceased. The witness said Yvonne said she loved both men, with the witness saying something like, "You can't have it both ways." According to them, Yvonne's answer was, "I killed one husband, I can kill another." The son, who was also in this interview, said that he had asked where the father of her child was, her answer being, "He's not with us anymore." He asked what happened, and she answered, "Well, I killed him." She also said that she was drunk that night and didn't remember much. In 2013, detectives interviewed some of Meyer's fellow inmates. Those inmates said that Meyer liked to talk about how he'd been in an ongoing relationship with Yvonne around the time of the murder, that Yvonne had instructed him to throw the murder weapon in the garbage so it would be picked up in the morning by trash collection. Yvonne died in 2015 of acute alcohol poisoning and was never formally accused or charged with murder. More years would pass before any further progress on Benny Scruggs' murder investigation. In 2017, an inmate would tell detectives that Meyer had told him he had committed the murder, that he had done it because Yvonne had refused to be with him till her husband was dead. The same inmate had overheard him talking to someone on the phone about the murder. Police obtained the recording of the phone call. In 2022, Donald Meyer, now 60 years old, was charged with the murder of Benny Scruggs. In September 2022, he refused to come out of his cell for his preliminary hearing and refused to work with his public defender. In December, Meyer's public defender tried to get him a new preliminary hearing, but the judge said that they would not reward bad behavior. Meyer was present for this hearing and pleaded not guilty. His trial is currently set up for a video conference in April 2023. It is during this trial we will find out what evidence law enforcement has against Meyer. However, regardless of the circumstances, he either perpetrated the murder or helped Yvonne cover up a murder case for 4 decades. Number 3. Jennifer Brinkman. On March 24, 1998, in Marysville, Washington, A father returned home from vacation with his girlfriend to find his 19-year-old daughter deceased in her bedroom. The girl was Jennifer Brinkman, who was supposed to be on this vacation, but last minute had decided to stay home. An autopsy would later show that she'd been hit in the neck by an axe. News reports from '98 would say that they didn't find the murder weapon, but more recent reports say that the axe was found at the crime scene. Authorities at the time also collected other evidence and DNA samples. Jennifer was described as a social person known to walk around Marysville, to strike up conversations with strangers. She often used telephone, dating, and chat lines, which were used frequently in the 90s, to chat and connect with strangers. She was also known to use library computers to access online chat rooms. The Marysville Police Department would send in the evidence to the crime lab, but they were unable to get any matches to anything, and DNA was not as advanced as it is today. Jennifer's case would eventually go cold, and the case would move from detective to detective, but the Marysville police never forgot her. As DNA advanced, they were able to get a DNA sample that didn't belong to Jennifer, individual A, but they didn't have anyone to compare the sample to. The Marysville Police Department eventually partnered with Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs. They would use genetic genealogy and publicly offered profiles to find a potential list of suspects. One of these suspects had already been on their radar for years. The suspect had been a person of interest Jennifer had talked to on one of the chat lines, and the suspect had sent a letter to Jennifer just prior to her death. But when the suspect had previously interviewed earlier in the investigation, he denied ever knowing or having contact with Jennifer. With this advanced DNA analysis, they could get a search warrant for the suspect's DNA. With the warrant, he volunteered his DNA willingly, and it was an exact match. He was arrested in November 2022 with first-degree murder. In November, the Marysville Police Department held a press conference announcing that they had arrested a suspect, a 52-year-old man. They did not reveal his name at that time. The police said that they are still getting all of the pieces together. In this press conference, they said that the letter had wording that implied that they had met before. The suspect lived only 3 miles from Jennifer's mother's house, but they didn't know if they had met in the past while Jennifer visited her mother. The suspect would have been 28 years old at the time of Jennifer's murder. They said that the suspect had used his right to remain silent, and that they may never get an answer to the motive. Since the murder, he has worked and lived as a hermit, and he is not suspected in any other murders, nor evidence that he is connected to any other crimes. After 24 years, they could tell Jennifer's mother that they had found who did this. The press conference revealed that Jennifer's mother was extremely emotional. She cried and was very thankful for the work that was put into her case. Jennifer's father passed away in 2013. There may never be answers as to why this happened, but the family can hopefully find some justice for Jennifer. The suspect is currently being held on charges of first-degree murder in Snohomish County Jail. At this time, there are no further announcements on the next court dates or when his identity will be released to the public. Amber Duncan Wilson. On July 9, 2012, Amber Duncan Wilson was out with her friends in Linden, New Jersey. Amber had just graduated high school with honors. The cheerleader had also hoped to pursue a career in criminal justice. She had full scholarship in September at St. Peter's University. She wanted to make a difference in this world and become a state trooper. A classmate said of Amber, she was always so nice, she never treated anyone differently because of her status as a cheerleading captain. She was always the most helpful person on the team. She always made sure if you didn't understand something, you could come to her. Amber was heading home with a friend, and the two had decided to stop in at Dunkin' Donuts to grab a snack. While they were walking there, they were approached by a person. The two were robbed and words were exchanged. The girls only had their cell phones and a couple of dollars in cash. Suddenly, Amber was shot point blank, killing her almost instantly. Her family has been devastated by this tragedy and is asking for help from the public to get justice for Amber's murder. In a statement to the media, Union County Prosecutor Daniel Wilson said, Miss Wilson Duncan was a young, ambitious woman who had a meaningful life ahead of her. Sadly, that life was senselessly lost at such a young age, and we remain as firmly committed today as we did 10 years ago in finding this cold-blooded killer and bringing justice for her and her loved ones. There is a $10,000 reward for any information that leads to an arrest. If you have any information, you are asked to call the Union County Crime Stoppers.
She went out with a friend. They were going to Dunkin' Donuts because she loved brownies. They were at the Dunkin' Donuts, and she had said, "Oh well, Dad, I'll see you tomorrow." And pretty much that was the last time I spoke to her.
Police say just before midnight on July 9th, 2012, Amber and a friend were on Hussa Street when they were approached and robbed. Words were exchanged and Amber was shot in the head.
The girls had a few dollars on them. They had cell phones.
Her father still can't believe it happened.
She was a sweet girl. She never gave me any trouble. She was good in school. The toughest loss in my life.
Amber was a cheerleader, loved butterflies, and had a scholarship to study criminal justice at St. Peter's University in Jersey City. She wanted to be a state trooper.
She had participated in the Trooper Youth program for a week, and she said, "Dad, that was one of the toughest things I've ever been through."
That dream gone in an instant. It's been 10 long years with no suspect in sight.
The wheels of justice grind ever so slow. If somebody knows something, her friend obviously knows who it was, but for fear of retribution, I guess she hasn't said anything.
That's what you believe?
Yes.
Newark, Marsh Jane Doe. On October 24, 1985, two hunters stumbled upon a significantly decomposed body in a marshland area in Newark, California. According to the Newark Police Department, her body was barely recognizable by the time she was found. At the time, police were able to establish that the victim had been shot. They were unable to establish exactly when she died due to the conditions of the marsh, but it could have been anywhere from 2 months to 1 year prior to her discovery. Police were limited in what they could determine, so they turned to forensic anthropologists for a more precise profile of the Jane Doe. With careful analysis of her skeletal remains, they determined that she had been between 5'6" and 5'8", and had brown and auburn shoulder-length hair. She was estimated to have been between the ages of 25 and 36 when she died, and her bottom 2 front teeth were missing from her remains and had likely been missing for some time, as the 2 teeth next to them had been growing at an inward angle to close the gap. This is a distinguishing feature that police believe people who knew her would have recognized, and that anyone who has been looking for her would be able to identify her by. The only items found on her were a hair barrette, a watch, earrings, and a ring on her pinky finger, but no identifying items like a wallet or purse were recovered from the scene. For nearly 40 years, no one has come forward to identify her. Her identity and her murder have remained a mystery all these years. Then, just a few years ago, her case was reopened, and when new technology allowed forensic scientists to extract DNA from hair strands taken from the victim, advanced DNA analysis might be able to potentially match her to relatives. To find matches for the victim, the Newark police partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit that builds and uses genetic information to identify John and Jane Does. Volunteers from organizations like this have solved dozens of unidentified persons cases around the country. The DNA Doe Project ended up finding a potential mother match for the unidentified Jane Doe, a woman named Marianne Mary Richardson, from a small town in Missouri. Unfortunately, she is no longer alive, which has led to a dead end for the lead. They went on to pursue another lead, a relative in Texas, who was determined to be a potential half-sister of the victim. That half-sister, Ruth Ellis, however, had been adopted as a 1-month-old and does not know her biological family. Investigators believe that their Jane Doe had been adopted as well in the late 1940s, causing her to end up in California. So far, adoption records have not turned up any additional clues. Despite these promising leads, the adoption has complicated the investigators' DNA angle, and the Newark Jane Doe remains nameless and unclaimed by relatives or loved ones. A reconstructed image of what she likely would have looked like is newly available, and investigators hope someone will see it who recognizes her and comes forward to solve this mystery once and for all. Diana Alt. It was just after midnight on January 31st, 1994, when 26-year-old Diana Alt was found dead on the floor in her home in Independence, Missouri. She and her children had been at a Super Bowl watch party and had arrived home later than usual. The killer, who had broken into their home in their absence, shot Diana at close range in the side of the neck as she walked down the hallway towards the kitchen. Her 2 children, ages 4 and 7 months, were in the house with her at the time she was killed, but were too young to call for help. That night, Diana's red Pontiac was discovered in a nearby church parking lot by police when neighbors called to report suspicious activity. Inside the vehicle, authorities discovered a revolver, ammunition, and shell casings. The car had been left with the key in the ignition still running. Given this alarming discovery, they immediately rushed to Diana's home, where they found her body. Although no one has ever been officially identified as a suspect, investigators did uncover what they believed to be a connection between Diana's murder and the 1989 stabbing of 18-year-old Sarah DeLon in Kansas City. A woman named Carolyn Heckert, who had an affair with Diana's husband, had also dated DeLon's boyfriend. Heckert was charged with both crimes, but a judge ended up dismissing her charges due to lack of evidence. Diana Alt's case has gone unsolved for almost 30 years, but this March, police announced that they would be reopening her case. Diana's family is hoping they will finally receive the answers they've been hoping for all these years. According to Lauren Freeman, a detective with the Independence Police and a member of the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force, her team is cautiously optimistic about the case. She confirmed that they are following several new leads, but are not able to confirm what those leads are at this time. Diana's family and friends are hopeful that these new leads will bring justice to Diana's murder. Ivan Darling. This June, investigators announced they will take a fresh look at the 1986 murder of Ivan Darling in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was Christmas Day when a relative visiting from Maryland arrived at Ivan's house to take him for a family dinner. When she arrived, she made a shocking and sad discovery. 79-year-old Ivan Darling had died and had clearly not died of any natural causes. Ivan had sustained numerous puncture wounds and had likely died of blood loss from those wounds, according to Gettysburg police. The murder weapon remains unknown, but the puncture wounds it created were likely left by a small knife. According to investigators, he appeared to have died 2 to 3 days prior to his discovery. The motive in his murder is believed to have been a robbery, as several items were missing from his home. Despite police following numerous leads after the murder, none turned up anything substantial, and a suspect has still never been identified. The case has gone cold, but in late June, District Attorney Brian Sinnett announced that the Adams County DA's office will be taking a fresh look at the 1986 murder of Darling. Sinnett and his team are optimistic that new technology and advances in DNA profiling may allow them to explore new leads that could not previously be obtained. Deborah Ann Simca. It was September 26, 1981 on Father's Day nearly 40 years ago when 22-year-old Deborah Ann Simca was found dead in her home in Brisbane, Australia. Her roommate discovered her body in disturbing circumstances before contacting the police. Deborah had been found in her kitchen. The upper portion of her body had been placed inside a gas oven. The gas knob on that oven had been turned on, and 2 small fires had been set in other parts of the house. But Deborah had not died of smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide poisoning. She had been strangled with a dog leash, which remained hanging around her neck when police arrived at the scene. Police soon speculated that Deborah's killer had attempted to set fire to the house and destroy the evidence, perhaps even making it look as if the victim had died in a fire. This was indicated by the small fires set in other rooms and by Deborah being positioned partially inside the oven, presumably so she would catch on fire quickly. This May, police launched a fresh public appeal for new information leading to Deborah's killer, offering $500,000 reward for information leading to the identification and conviction of the person or persons who murdered Deborah. On the day of her death, Deborah was seen in her yard with a young man around 4 p.m. He appeared to be in his early 20s with dark hair and a slim build. Then later that evening, around 7:30 p.m., someone noticed 2 people sitting on the front porch of their home. A description of them was not provided. Detectives are hoping to speak to any of these 3 individuals or anyone who has information about them. The Queensland police are confident that there are individuals out there who know something and can provide crucial information regarding the case. They are hopeful that the new significant reward will encourage those to reconsider reservations they may have previously had. After 40 years, it's time for Deborah's loved ones to know what happened to her on that terrible night. Orlando Julio Adams. In October of 2000, just a few months shy of his 24th birthday, Orlando Julio Adams was shot and killed in his home in Norfolk, Virginia. For 22 years, Alondo's family has been left grappling with uncertainty, wondering who killed their lovable son, brother, and young father. His case has gone cold, but just this year it's been reopened. According to Detective Jonathan Smith, who is now leading the homicide investigation, reopening the case all these years later makes sense, even after Alondo's old apartment complex has been knocked down, destroying any forensic evidence that might have remained inside. The hope is that people may have information that they were too afraid to share in the past, but would be willing to share now. Alondo was in his apartment on Virginia Beach Boulevard when two unknown men knocked on his door. Alondo apparently did not open the door, but one of the men fired a shot at him through the door. He was shot and killed in his own home. Alondo's family says that they do not know of anyone who disliked him and can't think of a reason someone might want to hurt him. The case remains unsolved 22 years later, and police continue to pursue new leads. I would be remiss if I did not remark on just how little information there is about this case, especially in comparison to other cold cases that I have covered. Media interest in this case seems to be nearly non-existent and is limited to only local news stations. Considering the case was just reopened in May of this year, there should be a flurry of coverage. But as a black man, Alondo's case has clearly been overlooked and deprioritized all these years. Media outlets, law enforcement agencies, and internet sleuths alike need to treat cold cases involving all victims with the same importance as any other case. It's sad that this even needs to be said, but the bias is clear, and this pattern needs to change. Number 3. Mojave Jane Doe. January 23, 1971, 3 hunters making their way down the Hackesbury Road in a remote part of Mojave County, Arizona, near U.S. Highway 93, made a startling discovery. One of the 3 men had seen something that had caught his eye just off the dirt road. In the distance lay a white canvas sack that had been tied at the top with rope. Something about the bag immediately unsettled the men, and they decided to take a closer look. Upon inspection, the bag read, "Deer Pack Ames Harris Neville Co., and something was inside. When they opened the bag, they found the body of a young woman. Horrified, the 3 men rushed back to their car, flagged down the first available officer, and within hours, the once quiet dirt road was now swarming with Mojave County Sheriff's Office investigators. Her body and the woven sack that she'd been found in were photographed and then transported to the closest coroner's office for autopsy. In the report, the coroner noted that the body belonged to a white female between the ages of 35 and 50, brown curly hair, and was about 125 to 140 pounds. It was also noted that the woman had an indentation on her left ring finger, possibly indicating that she had worn a wedding band or an engagement ring, and that she had a long scar on her abdomen. The scar possibly indicated to the coroner that the woman had given birth via cesarean section at least once in her life. This woman perhaps had a husband and children who would come looking for her, but this would later prove to be wrong. The report also detailed that her fingernails were meticulously manicured and that she was found wearing a size 14 long-sleeve shirt, black long-sleeved cardigan sweater, a size 12 burnt orange stretch pants, black leather ankle boots, and white socks. She'd also undergone extensive and expensive dental work, with experts estimating that in 1971, these procedures would have cost around $2,000, or around $15,000 in today's dollars. This type of dental work was rare at the time and was reserved for those with money and access to good medical and dental care. With no immediate leads, investigators pinned their hopes on the woman's distinctive dental. Her dental x-rays were published in papers and dental journals across the U.S., hoping a dentist would recognize their handiwork, but no one came forward. After months with no one stepping forward to claim this woman, the Mojave County Sheriff's Department called her the Mojave Jane Doe. The coroner had ruled her passing a homicide and deemed that she had died due to strangulation. Multiple efforts were made to identify her, with her fingerprints being sent to the FBI and the Museum of North Arizona using her skull to create a composite sketch, but all of these efforts fell flat. Investigators could not believe that a woman who possibly had a husband and children could remain unclaimed. Months slowly turned into years, and the Mojave Jane Doe case turned cold. Investigators never gave up hope. In 1971, DNA analysis was another 10 years away. However, investigators ensured to preserve as much evidence as they could. This would come in handy many years down the line. The Mojave County Sheriff's Department left no stone unturned in this investigation. According to reports, they followed up on missing person reports from Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah, checked hospitals, motels, hotels, and stores, and broadcasted sketches of Jane Doe across the states. In 2021, the Mojave Jane Doe was finally added to the NamUs database. The case found renewed interest thanks to the entry, and in 2022, the Mojave County Sheriff's Office teamed up with Othram Labs. Othram Incorporated, based in Texas, offered genetic genealogy services to governmental organizations. In 2022, they worked with the Mojave County Sheriff's Office to obtain a DNA sample from the Jane Doe. There was only one major issue that Othram faced was funding. The true crime community responded astoundingly, and the $6,500 needed to fund the DNA sequencing was raised in just 5 days. In January 2023, the long-awaited announcement from Othram was finally made, and the Mojave Jane Doe was identified as Colleen Audrey Reyes. Colleen was born on March 17, 1931 in Portsmouth, Ohio, to James C. Rice and Flossie Truitt. In 1946, she married William Davis and became estranged from her family soon after finishing Portsmouth High School. Investigators could not determine whether Colleen had ever given birth, as no birth records had been recovered. The Mojave County Sheriff's Department is still looking for the person responsible for Colleen's murder. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Mojave County Sheriff's Office at 928-753-0753, quoting case number DR number 710383.
Colleen Audrey Rice was recently identified as the homicide victim found in a canvas sack in the desert in Mojave County, Arizona. Her case was reopened in 2021, and in 2022, genealogists were brought on board to determine her family tree. They were able to locate a living distant relative with the records they found and confirmed her identity. They also found that she's from Portsmouth, Ohio, and was estranged from her family. Records also show that she was married to a man named William Davis, who's from Ohio as well, in 1946. But no other information past that year has surfaced yet. But her story doesn't end there. In addition to being from Portsmouth, Ohio, investigator Miller says Rice also has connections to eastern Kentucky, and one of the challenges they're facing right now is finding people who were around when this incident happened.
Yes, this became quite daunting in the fact that trying to locate people who might still be alive.
I was able to find a distant relative of Rice. His name is Eli Allen, and he's from Scioto County, Ohio. Allen says when learning about the case and hearing the name, he soon found they were related.
When I saw Rice, which is in my mother's line, I have to know how we're related because it was that much more intimate.
Allen is also a genealogist himself, and he says identifying one of his distant relatives who didn't have a name for more than 50 years is a testimony to the importance of the work he and so many others are doing.
To look back into and say this is how this person ties to this person. So without work of genealogist, that work would be much more difficult.
Number 2. Bucks County John Doe. In June 1986, a fisherman making his way down the Delaware River made a horrific discovery. Close to the Morrisville boat ramp on the Pennsylvania side of the river, the fisherman discovered a human skull right on the riverbank. According to Othram, as the fisherman lived in Buckingham Township, Pennsylvania, he turned the skull over to the Buckingham Township Police, and they handled the subsequent investigation. A sweep of the scene was conducted, but no other bones could be found. The coroner confirmed that the skull was human and likely belonged to an adult male. As the remains discovered were only partial, investigators had a hard time creating a profile. They could not cross-reference missing persons cases in the area, as the skull had no identifiable characteristics. In 1986, DNA testing was still in its infancy, and with few leads, the Buckingham Township Police called in the Bucks County John Doe. The coroner had also been unable to determine the cause of death, only adding to the mystery. Investigators had a few ideas about who the skull belonged to, but the case went nowhere without concrete evidence. For decades, the case remained cold until 2019, when the Bucks County Coroner's Office took possession of the remains. Once in possession of the skull, the coroner's office entered it into NamUs, hoping that this would aid in identification in the future. In September 2022, the chain of custody would change again when the Bucks County detectives obtained the remains from the coroner's office. This group of detectives then reached out to Othram Labs, one of the most prominent players when it comes to DNA sequencing and genealogical analysis. According to Othram, CBC News, Othram obtained a DNA sample from the skull and began searching through public genealogy databases for a match. And they got one. A 49-year-old woman whose name has been withheld per her request was found to be a match to the skull found in 1986. The woman from Florida told investigators that her father had disappeared in 1985 in Trenton, New Jersey. Another DNA sample was obtained from the woman, which confirmed the parent-child relationship between herself and the remains. In January 2023, Othram, alongside the Bucks County District Attorney's Office, announced that the Bucks County John Doe had been identified as 31-year-old Richard Thomas Alt. Richard was last seen by his parents on December 24th, in 1984 in Trenton, New Jersey. His disappearance was not reported until early 1985. In April 1985, the body of Richard's girlfriend, Lori Sudnam, was discovered in the Delaware River close to Trenton. Following this discovery and the reports of Richard's disappearance, investigators began treating both of their cases as suspected homicides. Unfortunately, investigators had no idea that Richard's skull had been discovered in early 1986. Minimal evidence and few leads led to the case being closed. Neither investigators nor Richard's family had any idea that his body had been found just 8.5 miles away from the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. Bucks County District Attorney Matt Weintraub told CBS News, quote, "I hope that this powerful combination of technology and genealogy becomes a template for solving cold case and current cases now and in the future. I can't imagine having lost a family member for even a day, let alone 37 years. That wait is now over for Mr. Alt's family. I'm just glad that we could give them some peace of mind with this identification and the eventual return of his remains to his family." The Bucks County District Attorney's Office has reopened the investigation into Richard's death. Anyone with information is being asked to contact the District Attorney's Office at 215-348-6344. Number 1. Newport Jane Doe. On November 17, 2012, a group of excited amateur treasure hunters gathered at an abandoned coal mining site on Alden Mountain in Newport Township, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The group had chosen the area as it had once been the home of a thriving coal industry, with mines dotted across the landscape. As the world began to move away from coal and fossil fuels, the mine shut down, leaving artifacts behind to be discovered by generations to come. This group readied their shovels and metal detectors, but their excitement was short-lived. Shortly after the digging commenced, some group members dropped their shovels in horror. They had come across something solid that let out a loud dink. When they shoveled the dirt away, they recoiled in horror as they discovered a long white bone staring back at them. Everyone in the group put down their shovels, took 10 steps back, and contacted the Pennsylvania State Troopers. The lively scene had now fallen into a somber mood. The Pennsylvania State Police cordoned off the scene and got to work recovering the remains, which were then transported to the local coroner's office. A few days after the discovery of the remains, the coroner's report was released, in which they noted that the remains likely belonged to a female in her late teens to early 20s. Her race was listed as unknown, but possibly an admixture of Caucasian, Hispanic, or Native American. The final parts of the coroner's report was probably the most chilling. It listed that the girl likely met foul play all the way back in the 1960s. How had her remains gone unnoticed and undiscovered for over 50 years? As the remains were determined to have possibly belonged to a teenager, NCMCE, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, became involved in the investigation. They created a composite sketch using her skull and circulated these images via news stations and social media. Whilst this did generate a few leads, none of them panned out, but the investigation was back to square one. A sample of her DNA was also submitted to police databases across the U.S., but again this generated no leads. Missing person cases were cross-referenced, but their leads fell apart each time investigators got close. In 2022, Pennsylvania state troopers contacted Othram Labs and asked for their assistance. The Newport Jane Doe's DNA had previously been run, but only through police and governmental databases. This time, Othram was able to utilize public databases. Months after the DNA had been sequenced and cross-referenced against millions of samples, Othram contacted the Pennsylvania state troopers, telling them they had found a possible family member. This potential family member was contacted and asked to provide another DNA sample to develop a complete profile. Genealogists at Othram also worked with them to create a complete family tree. In October of 2022, Othram and Pennsylvania state troopers announced to the world that the remains found in 2012 belonged to 14-year-old Joan Joni Marie Diamond. Joni disappeared from her home in Andover Street in Wilkes-Barre on June 25, 1969, after telling her family she was going to play outside. The family had just eaten supper, and Joni was never seen or heard from again. The Pennsylvania state troopers are investigating what happened to Joni. Anyone with information is asked to contact the trooper Edward J. Urban of the Pennsylvania State Troopers at 570-542-4177, quoting case number P04-0744558.
Finally, some answers in a cold case that dates back more than 50 years.
How the teenage victim was identified decades after she went missing. It's our top story on Newswatch 16 at 6. Good evening, I'm Lisa Washington.
And I'm Scott Shea. For more than 50 years after that teenager went missing, her remains have been identified. The task now, find out who killed her. State police held a news conference in Wilkes-Barre, sharing new details on the case and what the next steps are.
Newswatch 16's Renee Workman explains the new information state police revealed today at the news conference.
More than 50 years after she disappeared in Luzerne County, the case of Joan Marie Diamond is one step closer to being solved. The 14-year-old was last seen on June 25, 1969.
After supper, she told her family she was going to go to the Andover Street Park in Wilkes-Barre, and she never returned. It was the last time Joan was ever seen by her family.
During a news conference at the state police barracks near Wilkes-Barre, Joan's older sister Suzanne told us that before Joan disappeared, she was ecstatic at the thought of becoming an aunt.
I was pregnant. I was due in August, and we spoke, and she was excited about being an aunt and me having a baby and coming down to visit and maybe help me out. And then she just disappeared.
Remains found in November 2012 at a former coal mining operation near Nanticoke have now been identified as belonging to Joan. State police provided photos of the location. Donations made to the Luzerne Foundation helped pay for the genetic genealogy tests that identified Joan's remains.
I know a lot of people believe that cases are forgotten. This is truly evidence that the cases are not forgotten.
It's a shame somebody so young and with her whole life ahead of her was taken. She was a sweet girl who didn't deserve what happened to her.
Investigators would not say how Joan died, but they call her death a homicide. State police hope former classmates from the class of 1973 at Myers High School may be able to help catch her killer.
We're talking people who went to school with her, maybe played sports with her, went to church with her. If you knew her at all, we're looking to speak with you.
Number 1. Lady of the Dunes. On July 26, 1974, a 12-year-old girl was walking her dog in the Cape Cod Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts, when she came across a naked woman she thought was sunbathing. The woman was lying face down on a beach blanket. but when she got closer, she made a realization that made her blood run cold, and she bolted. The police were called and they confirmed that the woman was deceased. The woman was missing her hands. Her nearly decapitated head was resting on a pair of folded jeans and a blue bandana. It was determined that she had likely been there for 2 weeks before the discovery of her body, which already gave law enforcement a disadvantage in identifying her. She would be called Lady of the Dunes and become Massachusetts' longest unidentified homicide victim. She was described as a redhead with an athletic build and medium height. Her hair had been pulled back into a ponytail, and her toes were painted with pink nail polish. The thing that had led to the biggest hope of someone recognizing her was that the Jane Doe had extensive dental work with multiple gold crowns, which was estimated to have cost upwards of $5,000 at the time. It was also estimated that she was in her 30s. At the time of her discovery, there was very little for police to go on. There were 2 sets of footprints that led to her body. Her cause of death was determined to be severe blunt force trauma to the skull, and her autopsy revealed that she'd been sexually assaulted, likely post-mortem. In addition to her hands being removed, she was also missing a forearm. Detectives canvassed nearby motels, rooming houses, and thousands of missing women reports, but nothing matched. They even had a clay model reconstruction of the woman. However, despite best efforts, there could be little uncovered about the woman, and the case would ultimately go cold for many decades. Over the years, there had been many theories locally about who this mystery woman was. One of these theories was that she had worked as an extra for the movie Jaws, which had been filmed earlier that year in Martha's Vineyard, but that had never been confirmed. Several other people had come forward throughout the years, thinking that she was their missing sibling or someone they knew, but each time the identification was ruled out. Throughout the years, they exhumed her body more than once to re-examine her remains and look for new clues. Her skull was removed in order to create a new artistic rendering of what she might have looked like. In 2000, a DNA sample was collected and stored, and in 2022, the DNA was sent to Ortham Labs, world-renowned for using genetic genealogy to identify unknown individuals. On October 31, 2022, the Massachusetts State Police, with the FBI, announced that the Lady of the Dunes had been identified as Ruth Marie Terry after nearly 50 years after her body was discovered. She had been 37 years old at the time of her death.
We are standing here today to announce that after nearly a half-century of investigative efforts, we have identified the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts, known as the Lady of the Dunes. She is Ruth Marie Terry from Tennessee, who was just 37 years old at the time of her death. The FBI identified Ruth using investigative genealogy. This is a unique method that can generate new leads for unsolved homicides, as well as help identify unknown victims. This is, without a doubt, a major break in the investigation that will, hopefully, bring all of us closer to identifying the killer.
Today, over 48 years after her murder and discovery, we can finally say her name, Ruth Marie Terry. We know Ruth had family and friends who loved her, and we are aware that this development has not been an easy one for them, so we keep them in our thoughts today during this difficult time. Certainly, during the years that they were in contact with her, they never envisioned the outcome for the child, the teenage girl, the young woman they knew, loved, and cared about. We hope today's announcement helps shed some light on the many questions they have had these many years and marks another step towards answering more of them. For many police investigators at the end of their careers, there is often an unresolved case that haunts them, that intrudes upon the days, years, and decades of the rest of their lives. This case has been that for generations of Provincetown police officers and Massachusetts state troopers.
The highest calling in this job is to give voice to the voiceless and to serve victims and their families. And it may take months, it may take years. This case, it's taken over 4 decades, but no one's stopping. And this is a very important development, but we're on to the next round. as Joe and Colonel Mason went over. We need help from the public. We welcome more information. We're determined to solve this crime.
If Ruth Marie hadn't met her assailant in 1974, she could be 86 years old today. If the person responsible for the crime was in his or her 20s or 30s, he would be in his late 60s or 70s. If he was a little older, he may well be dead, but we will assume he is not. And we will pursue every lead and every clue to bring this person to justice.
Ruth was born on September 8, 1936, in a small mining town in Tennessee. By the time she was 20, she had left home and was married for the first time. By 1957, she was divorced and working in a car manufacturing plant in Michigan. She got pregnant and had a child, but she gave the child up for adoption to a family that worked at the plant. Then she left Michigan shortly after that. The child, Richard Hanchett, put his DNA into Ancestry.com in 2018 in the hopes of finding family related to his mother. He was able to connect with some family, but also discovered that his mother had been missing since the 1970s. This was the connection that was used to identify Ruth. Sometime in 1974, Ruth went to visit family in Tennessee with a new husband, Guy Rockwell Maldivin. After this visit, Ruth's family never heard from her again. Ruth's sister-in-law, Carol Terry, is quoted as saying, "I always had a bad feeling about that guy that she had married." They'd only been married for 6 months before her body was discovered. Once she had gone missing, Maldivin disappeared, never reporting his new bride missing. Ruth had been known to use several different variations of her name. Law enforcement say that she had connections to Tennessee, Michigan, and California, and they are looking for more information about her life before and up to 1974. Authorities announced shortly after Ruth was identified that they were also looking for any information about Guy Maldivin. He also used several names, was known to travel around the U.S., and was the lead suspect in the murder of his second wife and stepdaughter in 1960 in Seattle, Washington. It is strongly believed that he is responsible for Ruth's murder, the murders in Seattle, and an additional murder of an unknown victim. After he fled Washington, human remains were discovered in the septic tank of his home. He is also the lead suspect in 2 murders in June of 1950 in Humboldt, California. 28-year-old Henry Barrett was murdered, and 17-year-old Barbara Jo Kelly was dating Maldivin when she disappeared and her body was never discovered. Guy Rockwell Maldivin died at the age of 78 in 2002 in Salinas, California. Law enforcement are still working to positively identify Maldivin as the killer, though they are open to looking at other individuals. Number 2. The Bear Brook Victims. On November 10, 1985, a group of hunters discovered 2 bodies in a metal drum at the Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. Determined to be an adult female between the ages of 23 and 33, with dark curly hair and extensive dental work, and a little girl between the ages of 5 and 11 with a gap between her teeth and dark hair. The initial investigation followed every lead and ruled out several possible identities. 15 years later, in 2000, 2 more bodies were found in the same area in a similar metal drum. Authorities say that it was missed because it was likely outside the initial investigation search perimeter. The other 2 bodies were also discovered to be female, aged 2 and 4 with dark hair and an overbite, and a girl between the ages of 1 to 3 with light hair and a gap in her front teeth. The Allenstown Police Department could not identify the victims, and they would eventually be called the Bear Brook Murders or the Allenstown 4. In 2013 and 2015, different sets of composites of what the victims might have looked like were released in hopes of identifying them. In 2014, through DNA, they were able to determine that the woman and the oldest and the youngest child were related. The woman was the mother of the 2 children, and the 4th victim was not related to the others. In 2017, it was announced that all the bodies had been connected to serial killer Terry Petter Rasmussen. He was the biological father of the 4th unknown girl, aged 2 to 4. Unfortunately, Rasmussen died in prison in 2010 of lung cancer and could not be asked about these murders. He had been serving a life sentence for the murder of Yoon Jun. In 2019, authorities announced that they had identified the 3 related victims as Marylise Elizabeth Honeychurch, born in 1954, her daughters Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, born in 1971, and Sarah Lynn McWaters, born in 1977. They made the discovery with the help of a librarian, Rebecca Heath, who was researching the case and had come across posts on Ancestry.com looking for a long-lost half-sister named Sarah. The post dated back to as early as 1999. It wasn't until she got in touch with the family and asked if they were still looking for Sarah and if they had more information.
She was born in 1977, was born in California, and this individual was looking for her and her mother. And the more I start looking into Sarah McWaters, I find that there are family members that are looking for Sarah's mother, Marlise, and that Marlise had another daughter, Marie.
That's when the family said that all they knew was that she was last seen with her mother, sister, and a man named Rasmussen. Rebecca Heath then contacted Peter Headley, a deputy for the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, who worked with genealogists to help identify Rasmussen. With this new information, they could use DNA to positively identify the victims. Marylise had been married twice, having a child with each husband. Marylise and her daughters were last seen on Thanksgiving in 1978 when she fought with her mother over a man that she had brought with her, and his name was Terry Rasmussen. The only other assumed sighting of Marylise was 2 signed arrest reports for Robert Evans, a known alias of Rasmussen, signed by his wife, Elizabeth Evans, in February and June of 1980. There had been no mention of the kids in the police report, and they have not found any other relation to the unknown 4th victim other than she was the daughter of Terry Rasmussen. After identifying the 3 victims, officials ruled that Rasmussen had killed all 4. They are still looking for any information on identifying the last victim, Rasmussen's daughter, and there was a new composite made in 2019 of what she might have looked like. The child was likely born around 1975 or 1976, possibly in California, Texas, or Arizona. Rasmussen is being investigated for several other murders. In 1980, 14-year-old Lauren Rand and 25-year-old Denise Denal went missing. Their bodies were never found. Both victims lived within a mile of Rasmussen's home at the time. A surviving daughter of Rasmussen also told law enforcement that she remembered having 2 siblings, but that they had died, and it is believed that Rasmussen may have murdered those children as well, or one of them may be the unidentified child. Law enforcement are still working to identifying her, and they've dubbed her the middle child and finding her maternal family. As well, they are looking to determine if Rasmussen had more victims in the areas he lived in, which include Colorado, California, Texas, Arizona, Idaho, Virginia, Ohio, Oregon, Hawaii, and New Hampshire. While in New Hampshire in 1980, a woman named Elizabeth Evans was listed as his spouse, but this woman has never been identified. Aliases he was known to have used include Robert Bob Evans, Curtis Mayo Kimball, Gordon Jensen, Larry Vanner, and Gary Mockerman. Number 3. Gacy victim number 5. The Cook County Sheriff's Office has made an announcement in regards to the remaining unknown victims of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. In October 2021, one of the victims was identified with the help of the DNA Doe Project. This victim was known as Gacy victim number 5. For those who may not know, Gacy was a prolific serial killer who tortured and killed at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978 in Chicago.
Terry, the horrible truth to suburban contractor John Gacy's rambling statements to police last week is becoming more and more evident with each passing day. 6 more bodies unearthed from the basement crawl space of Gacy's Norwood Park Township home today, bringing to 15 the number found there since Friday. Des Plaines and Cook County Sheriff's Police investigators arrived first thing this morning to resume their search. The big white wagon, which has been used to transport bodies from the northwest suburb to the morgue, Fishbein Institute, pulled up early today and stood waiting outside the house while more digging went on inside. Also on the scene, crowds of onlookers, the curious, many of whom have stood to death watch for days. By late today, just about all the hollow spaces in the house had been opened up for the searchers. Floorboards and ceiling panels pried loose and carted out to the huge bin just outside the front door. Most of the attention has been centered on the 30-inch dirt crawl space, similar to one we photographed in a house near Gacy's. This is where 12 of the 13 bodies were buried. Searchers are being hindered by water, which keeps filling in their holes, a water problem which Gacy had used as an excuse to have trenches dug in the crawl space. Employees who did the actual digging said they thought drainage tiles were to be buried, not bodies.
Gacy had a total of 8 unidentified victims, and in 2011, the Cook County Sheriff's Office reopened the case in the hopes of identifying them. They partnered with the DNA Doe Project, an organization that uses DNA and genetic genealogy to identify Jane and John Does. Since 2011, they have identified 3 unidentified victims: Timothy McCoy, James Hackinson, and William Bundy. Now they have identified a 4th victim as Francis Wayne Alexander, who went by Wayne. Wayne would have been 21 or 22 at the time of his death. Originally from North Carolina, he had moved to Chicago after getting married in New York in 1975. However, the marriage only lasted 3 months and they divorced shortly after. The family never reported Wayne missing, as they had originally thought he wanted space after his divorce. The last known sighting of him was a traffic ticket that was issued on January 5, 1976 in Chicago. His remains were found in the crawl space of Gacy's home in 1978, and authorities believe he was killed between 1976 and 1977, most likely shortly after that traffic ticket, as according to records, he didn't make much income in 1976. Wayne is survived by his mother, 2 half-sisters, and 2 half-brothers. The family is also asking for their privacy at this time and does not wish to be identified, but they did prepare a statement to the media.
Our hearts are heavy. Our sympathies go to other victims' families. Our only comfort is knowing this killer no longer breathes the same air as we do.
Additionally, they have said that they were saddened by the news, but relieved to have answers and finally know what happened to him. Sheriff Dart, an investigator in this case, also said, quote, "This is the first time that we actually had a parent that was still alive in one of these cases." The Cook County Sheriff's Office is now looking towards identifying the remaining victims, known only as victim number 10, victim number 13, victim number 21, 27, and 28. All young males that would have gone missing from 1975 to 1977. Gacy was known to have abducted his victims from particular areas of Chicago, but he also lured some by promising them work or posing as a police officer, whatever it took to get them into his home. He was criminally active until his arrest in 1978. If you'd like me to cover Gacy more in depth, let me know down below in the comment section. Number 1. Amber Hagerman. On January 13, 1996 in Arlington, Texas, Amber Hagerman was riding her new pink and white bicycle that she'd just gotten for Christmas. In the parking lot of an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store, the 9-year-old Girl Scout was with her 5-year-old little brother, Ricky. They were playing down the road from their grandmother's house when apparently Ricky remembered they were only supposed to go around the block and headed back home. Amber stayed and continued to play around the parking lot. It was a Saturday, and they were at their grandparents' that day because their mother was being interviewed for a local news special about families that successfully got off welfare and rejoined the workforce. Amber and Ricky left their grandparents' home around 3:10 p.m., with Ricky returning shortly after without his sister. Families soon went looking for Amber, and when they arrived at the parking lot, they saw a handful of police officers surrounding Amber's bike. They were told that someone in the community saw something and that Amber had been abducted. A witness and retired police officer Jim Cavill, 78 at the time, said he saw Amber riding alone when he saw a black pickup truck and, quote, "He pulled up, jumped out, and grabbed her. When she screamed, I figured the police ought to know about it, so I called them. Jim gave a description of the abductor. He said that it was a man, Caucasian or Hispanic, in his 20s or 30s, shorter than 6 feet, medium build with dark hair. He was driving a black pickup truck with no markings or chrome and seemed to be in clean working condition. He noted the time of the abduction was 3:18 p.m. and Amber had only been alone for a few minutes. Law enforcement, the FBI, and locals began a massive search for Amber, and her abduction made national news. But despite the nationwide attention, no other witnesses ever came forward to identify the man or the vehicle. 4 days later, a man was walking his dog when he saw something in a creek. When he looked closer, he found a body lying face down in the water. Police arrived at the scene, and the body was identified as the missing 9-year-old Amber Hagerman. Amber's body was found less than 4 miles from where she was abducted. She was found completely naked except for a sock on her left foot, and her throat had been cut. Police believe that she was washed down the creek, as there had been considerable rainfall the night before she was discovered. Police worked hard to find anything on Amber's murder, but there was little evidence. It was later discovered that she had been alive for at least 2 days after her abduction, making police believe that someone might have seen something. Also, due to the circumstances of the abduction, they believe that Amber was targeted and may have been stalked prior to her being taken. Since Amber's death, law enforcement has followed over 7,000 possible leads. There was a laundromat next to the abandoned grocery store where Amber was abducted. Authorities know that this area had many Hispanic people who may have felt uncomfortable talking to police at the time. Police have said in more recent press releases that they do not care about legal status, and they just want any information on Amber and that it might be given anonymously, and urge anyone with information to come forward. They want justice for her family. In a 2021 press conference, it was released after all this time that they did have one piece of evidence with DNA. Police have stated that they would not reveal the evidence as only the killer would know. They had planned to test the evidence through more modern means later that year. Donna Williams, Amber's mother, said, quote, "To Amber's killer, I'm asking you today, please turn yourself in, give Amber justice. Amber needs justice deeply."
It's an emotional day for Donna Williams. She's back at the same place where 25 years ago her little girl was taken.
Her last words that I heard from her is, "Okay, Mommy, I will. I love you, Mommy." And that was the last I ever heard her, and I miss her voice.
While the years have gone by for Donna, it feels like yesterday.
I remember everything about her. There's nothing I have forgotten about her, because she is the love of my life.
It has been over 25 years since Amber was murdered. Police have never stopped looking for her killer, and she has had a significant impact not only on Arlington, but across the country. Amber's case was what inspired the Amber Alert system, which was suggested by a local woman, Diane Simone. She wanted to help in search efforts, but didn't know how to best assist. She had an idea to utilize radio station and news broadcasting to amplify missing or abducted children cases, using the existing systems that were used to alert to weather warnings or civil defense alerts. It has been called several names in honor of other missing children in other states, but is now called the Amber Alert System nationally and even internationally, with other countries adopting the system. In the U.S., the Amber Alert has saved over 1,114 children. Number 2, Little Miss Jane Doe / St. Louis Jane Doe. On February 28, 1983, 2 men entered an abandoned apartment building on Clemens Avenue in St. Louis, Missouri, scavenging for copper pipe or looking for something to fix their car. That detail is mixed. They looked around the house and then went down to the basement. When they got to the basement, they couldn't see anything, so one of the men lit a cigarette, and when he did, he saw something in the shadows. When the men looked closer, they found a child's body lying on her stomach, and the men called the police. When law enforcement arrived, they found the body of an African-American girl naked from the waist down, wearing a yellow V-neck long-sleeve sweater. She had been restrained behind the back with a red and white nylon rope. She had red nail polish on all her fingernails. The body had been decapitated, and the head was missing. After the autopsy, the medical examiner determined the girl to be between the ages of 8 and 11. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled before she had been decapitated. She had been well nourished with no signs of previous abuse, but her stomach was empty at the time of death. They took a mold sample of her body in the area and determined the girl had been killed 3 to 5 days before her body was discovered. Authorities and first responders searched a 16-mile radius of the surrounding area in sewers and dumpsters anywhere they could think of, but they never located the skull. Very little blood was found at the scene, so investigators believed that she was killed at another location and dumped at the apartment building. Investigators looked into local and national databases for any missing children fitting Jane Doe's description. They looked into school records for absent children. Within the next 7 months, they claimed to have accounted for every African American girl between the ages of 8 and 11 enrolled in school. It was then believed that she may have been from a different area. There were never any witnesses, and the police found no other evidence. They never identified little Jane Doe. Her case went cold. Captain Leroy Adkins, in a community meeting in 1983, said, quote, "Somebody out there knows something, and talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. Somewhere out there is a mother without a little girl, a brother without a sister, a neighbor without a little girl running up and down the street." 9 months after little Jane Doe was discovered, they gave her a funeral. The people that attended were predominantly detectives, reporters, and Reverend John W. Haywood presided over the service. She was buried in a white coffin in the Washington Park Cemetery in December 1983. Over the years, they have looked into many leads on this case, including sending the sweater to a psychic in Florida who wanted to touch the piece of clothing to see what they could discern from it, but the police never got the sweater back, and the psychic said that the sweater got lost in the mail. They also talked to a convicted murderer on death row in 2005, who had a similar MO, Vernon Brown. He had strangled other young girls in the 1980s, but he did not speak to detectives when interviewed, and his capital sentence went forward in May 2005. In 2009, police tried to exhume the body in hopes of running new tests to help identify the girl. They discovered she was not in the listed location where they went to find her. Instead, they found 3 other bodies. The Washington Park Cemetery had been neglected for years. Finally, with Washington University's help, they exhumed little Jane Doe's body in 2013. Tests were conducted by the Smithsonian Institution and the University of North Texas. They took DNA and bone samples from an isotope test. They were able to determine that she had lived most of her life in a southeastern state. On February 8, 2014, she was reburied following an hour-long ceremony. Many people attended, and she was buried in Cavalry Cemetery in St. Louis. Her grave marker identifies her as Hope. A former detective for the case, Joe Burgoon, said, quote, "Back then, I thought this would be an easy case to crack. We'd find out who the girl was and would lead us to the killer." The St. Louis City Cold Case Unit formed in 2019 and has a room dedicated to the case of little Jane Doe. They have never given up hope on identifying her. Jane Doe, 1983, as she is identified on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website, said she is the only case with no photo or facial reconstruction. There's only a picture of the sweater. The St. Louis Police Department is still looking for any information. Little Jane Doe grew up in southeast United States. She was approximately 4'10" to 5'2" between the ages of 8 and 11. She would have gone missing sometime in 1983. She had no distinctive marks or previous injuries. There are hopes that in identifying her, they will be closer to solving her murder. Number 3. Caitlin Dennison. In January 2018, 19-year-old Caitlin Dennison was living in Reno, Nevada, when she abruptly told her family that she was flying to Texas to be with an unknown man. The two had met 6 months prior in Reno, and when he had to fly back to Texas after 6 months, she decided to go with him. On January 10, 2018, Caitlin's sister, Rachel Dennison, received what would be the last time she heard her voice. Caitlin had called from a Walmart in Midland, Texas. On the call to her sister, she said that she wanted to come home and that this guy makes me scared for my life. She abruptly ended the call as the man approached. Caitlin sent her sister a pin of her location right after the phone call had ended. No one heard from Caitlin again. Rachel went to the police and reported her sister missing the next day. Law enforcement have said they got positive sightings of Caitlin that day at the Walmart she called from and Rick's Cabaret in Odessa, Texas. Caitlin was last seen wearing a fur vest over a black shirt, black leggings with braiding down the sides of the legs, and furry boots. A witness has come forward saying that they gave her a ride to her boyfriend's house, which was another confirmed sighting of Caitlin. Police have interviewed the unknown man. The information the man gave her that has been released is that Caitlin has been looking for work and had been having a hard time because of her noticeable arm scars. Police have interviewed the unknown man. He has been identified, but that information has been limited on what's been released to the public. The information we have is that he said that Caitlin had been looking for work and been having a hard time because she had noticeable arm scars. One day he came home and she and all of her stuff were just gone. When police went to interview this man again, he was nowhere to be found and has yet to be found. In August 2018, Rachel saw news coverage of a Ring doorbell of a woman in a t-shirt and arm restraints, and she thought it could have been Caitlin as she had the same build and bone structure. However, that woman was later identified and was not Caitlin. In this case, very little information has been released to the public by police or covered in the media. But in 2021, a YouTuber, Kendall Ray, released a video giving some more light on the case, causing a new detective to reopen the investigation. Midland Police Detective Jenny Alonzo said, quote, "The case came back to light in November of 2021 because a YouTuber had put her case online, and so it came back to our knowledge that she was still missing. I took on this case and I believe that there are other avenues of approach that we didn't do back in 2018 that we could do more follow-ups on." In a statement to the media, Rachel Dennison said, quote, "I am just really thankful we are finally able to communicate with someone who wants to listen to us and keep us in the loop, and do everything they can and are still willing to retrace steps that we thought were missed. It has been almost 5 years since Caitlin went missing. Her sister Rachel has never stopped the fight to look for her sister. They have an active Facebook page called Find Caitlin Dennison and a GoFundMe in the hopes of getting a private investigator and flights to go down to Texas. Police have given very little information to the family about what has been done to look for her. To this day, they still don't know the name of the man that she went to meet. Caitlin Dennison would be 23 years old today. At the time of her disappearance, she was 5'4", 120 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She has an alien head, an M tattoo on her left knuckle, a Libra scale tattoo on her right arm, 2 piercings on her nose on both sides, a bottom lip piercing, a tongue piercing, and a Medusa piercing. She also has scars on her arms and legs. Caitlin's family and Texas Rangers have been working to find answers to her disappearance and are asking for the public's help. If you may have seen Caitlin or know of her whereabouts or who she may have been with, please contact law enforcement. Number 1. Babes in the Woods. Vancouver, British Columbia's oldest cold case has recently had a new development, but the nearly 7-decade mystery hasn't been solved yet. It was on January 14, 1953, when skeletal remains were found in Stanley Park by a park employee. He had been going through a more remote part of the park when he stepped on something and crushed it. He examined further and found a woman's coat, and below the coat was a small skull. Investigators carefully excavated the area and found the remnants of 2 children's helmets, clothing, a picnic basket, and a hatchet, which was later determined to be the murder weapon. The remains were identified as belonging to 2 children, and they were given the moniker Babes in the Woods. It was estimated the bodies had been there since approximately 1947. The medical examiner that first worked the case concluded that one of the children was a female, which had hampered the investigation greatly. For decades, many theories had been constructed to attempt to explain why 2 young children had been murdered in Stanley Park. Although significant folklore has surrounded this case for years, we must not forget that these real children who died a tragic and heartbreaking death, said Inspector Dale Weedman in a statement to the media. All attempts to find the children's families had failed. Several different techniques were used to generate different visual reconstructions of what the children might have looked like, but it never helped the Vancouver Police Department in identifying them. In 1996, a scientist at UBC did DNA testing on some of the remains and determined that the remains were that of 2 boys, brothers in fact, and estimated the ages to be close to 6 and 10.
So after I received the position of Detective Sergeant in the Provincial Unsolved Homicide Unit, I wasn't carrying a caseload. I thought I would like to have a look at it, because the media had resurrected it so many times. And by the way, the media are the one that gave the name of the Babes in the Woods. It's from a Shakespeare's play, and that stuck with the file. So after resurrecting it, I discovered that the remains were on display in the Vancouver Police Museum. I did not think that was appropriate. So I went down one day without any authority from any of my superiors, and I seized all the remains. I took them out to my very good friend, Dr. David Sweet here at the Bureau of Legal Dentistry at UBC. And while I held the skulls, David was able to extract a tooth from each of the skulls. And then I'll pass it over to him in a minute to explain what he did. But after that, I took the remains to a crematorium that will remain strictly with me, because I'm not going to identify it to you. And I had the remains minus the skulls cremated. And then I arranged to have the remains taken with a police boat off of Kitsilano Point, and with the police chaplain at that time, dedicated the remains to the ocean. We had a nice little service, and the Children's Festival was on, but that was not planning on my part, it just was coincidence. Now, after the remains were interred into the sea, Dr. Sweet and I kept it to ourselves what biological remains were kept for future advancement in DNA and scientific research. We kept that secret for a lot of years, and we didn't release that because we thought it sounded kind of ghoulish for people that wanted to know, and believe me, there were people that wanted to know, but we kept that to ourselves. So the fallacy of that they were running out of DNA is incorrect, because there were lots of teeth in those skulls, and Dr. Sweet, God bless him, was able to extract DNA by pulverizing one of the teeth, and I'll ask him to explain it.
Sergeant Honeyborn wanted to confirm that in fact the information that was in the file at the time he was looking at it was true, and we could use modern DNA evidence of the day, mid-1990s, to extract a usable DNA source and to confirm that it was in fact a boy and a girl. We have developed at my laboratory this technology for extracting DNA from teeth and from bones. An armor coating covers the material that's inside, so the technique was to grind the tooth and then expose the DNA to the surface from where it could be recovered. We analyzed that with the technology of the day, which improved in a couple of years. The results, initial results, were confirmed with additional testing, and it was determined that they were not a boy and a girl. In fact, they were 2 boys that were related as half-brothers. They shared a mother but not a father. And so that became an extremely important part of the investigation, because it changed the thinking at the time and obviously changed the scope of the investigation, where the police were looking for a young boy and girl.
This changed the direction of the investigation greatly, as investigators now had more accurate information. In 2021, the VPD sent off samples of DNA and reached out to the Redgrave Research Forensic Services, a genetic genealogy company, to help build familial profiles. Over the last year, the Redgrave team had worked tirelessly to build out those trees, despite several challenges with the DNA, which after so long and had not been preserved well, had degraded significantly. Eventually, they identified ancestors they believed to be maternal grandparents. They reached out to family members who gave samples of their DNA and were able to confirm they had identified a tree of maternal relatives. After so many decades, the two little boys, previously only known as the Babes in the Woods, have been given their names back: Derek and David Dalton. The boys were 7 and 6 at the time of their deaths and had a surviving older sister. It is still unclear what happened. It seems to have been a closely guarded family secret, as surviving relatives had never known what had happened to the boys. Their mother passed in 1996 at the age of 78 and had always told relatives that the boys had been removed from her by Child Protection Services. The VPD didn't find any records matching either the mother's name or the boys. This may be where this case ends, as too much time has passed to get any more answers, but it can end with 2 children taken far too early, a chance to finally be laid to rest with their names and to be known as more than the Babes in the Woods. Number 2. Melissa Chevalier. It was late on November 25, 2005 in Thompson, Manitoba, when Melissa Chevalier was working a long shift as a cab driver. Melissa, those who knew her called her Lissa, was a 35-year-old single mother to a teenage son and was also a devoted foster parent, having housed over 20 children over the last 10 years. She loved fostering and supported her foster kids whenever they needed help, even if it had been years since they'd been in her care. Melissa drove cab part-time to supplement her income. Her full-time job was working as a care aide to adults with developmental disabilities. She had worked at North Star Cab for almost a decade, mostly picking up shifts from October to December to save up for Christmas, and on this Friday night was her normal graveyard shift. Around midnight, she was dispatched to a call to the Thompson Arena. The caller didn't leave a name or number with the dispatcher. Melissa called into the dispatcher to let them know that drop-off would be at the Ramada Hotel, now the Burntwood Hotel. RCMP have stated that they believe Melissa picked up 2 passengers at around 12:30 a.m. She drove into a parking lot behind the mall in Thompson, where she was attacked and killed by the people in her cab. Melissa had been stabbed several times while attempting to flee the vehicle. Her attackers fled on foot, captured on surveillance cameras going through a field east of the parking lot. Another cab driver had been sitting in his cab also in the mall parking lot and saw the taxi top light and went over to see what was going on. He attempted to help Melissa, but it was too late. The 2 suspects were never identified or found. The case had been cold for several years. It doesn't appear that Melissa had been robbed, and it is unclear what the motive was for the attack. Melissa was called the gentlest driver, and her manager said, if someone didn't have the money, she'd smile and say, "Pay later." She never would have gotten into a dispute with someone. After Melissa's murder, Thompson changed its bylaws to require all taxi cabs be fitted with cameras. There is a $14,000 reward for any information that leads to an arrest. Anyone with information are asked to contact Crime Stoppers. Number 3. Barbara Jean McLean. In the early morning hours of February 26, 1977, a man walking his dog along the gravel road in northern Calgary made a grisly discovery. The body of a young woman was discovered in a ditch. Her cause of death was strangulation, and she was later identified as Barbara Jean McLean. The 19-year-old had recently moved to Calgary from Nova Scotia and worked as a bank teller for Royal Bank. She shared her apartment with her boyfriend, and officers worked to trace back the events of the previous evening. Barbara Jean had a wide group of friends and was often seen at her favorite local bar. That was where she was the night before, at Highlander Bar with a group of friends. At some point in the evening, her boyfriend got kicked out of the bar for being too rowdy. He sat in the parking lot in his vehicle and waited for Barbara to come out. When the bar closed at 2:30 a.m., Barbara joined him in the car and they had a heated argument. Both of them were intoxicated, but her boyfriend drove off and left her alone in the parking lot. She had told a friend she was going to a house party and intended to hitchhike there. That was the last time Barbara was seen alive. The RCMP have stated that they believe Gary McAstogger is responsible for the crime. He was a registered sex offender that had been released on parole at the time and had been known to target women hitchhiking, but it was never definitively confirmed. McCastocker committed suicide before he could be questioned in connection to Barbara's murder. Barbara Jean's murder was also connected to several other women in the area that had been murdered in similar circumstances, alluding to the presence of a serial killer in the area. The case is still open, but there hasn't been any new developments in some time. Anyone with information is asked to call Crime Stoppers. Number 4. Mariella Lenny. Mariella Lenny was a 17-year-old student from Toledo, Northwest Territories. She had recently moved to Yellowknife, Yukon that September to finish high school and was staying with family. She was described as an outgoing and friendly person. And on October 6, 1991, she went missing from downtown Yellowknife. She was last seen around 6 p.m. near the Discovery Inn. She wasn't reported missing for 12 days, and little has been released about the case. Her body was found on May 8, 1992 in Great Slave Lake, 7 months after she had gone missing. Her body was identified with dental records. The RCMP have stated that there is enough evidence to suggest Mariella was murdered, but have declined to release any further information about the case, including cause of death. Her family have continued to advocate for Mariella and keep her cold case in the media. They are desperate to know the status of the investigation, and even after so many years, don't understand why the RCMP have declined to tell them more information about what had happened to their daughter. Mariella's murder was one of several in the Yukon in the 90s. Her case is among the hundreds of known murdered Indigenous women cold cases to have occurred between 1980 and 2012. Anyone with information is asked to contact the RCMP or Crime Stoppers. Number 1. James McLaughlin. February 27, 1998 was a cold winter day in Elyria, Ohio, a Cleveland suburb near Lake Erie, surrounded by parks and forest reserves. It was on this day that 57-year-old James McLaughlin disappeared from his Elyria home and has never been seen or heard from again. While there are few details available to the public on this case, it seems clear that James did not simply walk out of his home one day to run away or make a new life for himself elsewhere. James was not well at the time of his disappearance. He was under doctor's care for a condition that has been kept private, either due to the wishes of the police or James's family. Some speculate that he may have had cancer, but it has not been confirmed. We do know that whatever was wrong required regular prescription medication, yet he left his medication at home. James also could not have simply driven away to start a new life, because he was not able to drive at the time of his disappearance and depended on rides from others as a means of transportation. His checkbook was left behind as well, but it's unclear if he had a wallet with him or when he disappeared if his bank account had any activity when missing. This information too is being held by police. In an almost 25-year-old cold case, we can't help but wonder why so much information about this disappearance is being held back by the police. If James is alive today, he would be 82 years old. James hopes that someone out there may remember seeing James or may have information that will eventually lead to answers for his family. Number 2. Amanda K. Jones. Amanda K. Jones was just weeks away from giving birth when she disappeared in 2005. At 26 years old, she was already the mother of a young daughter and living in Hillsborough, Missouri. At 8.5 months pregnant, she was seemingly making one final attempt to convince the baby's father to be a part of his son's life. The father, Brian Westfall, was the last known person to have seen Amanda alive. Brian and Amanda met at her company's Christmas party on December 2004. Amanda was recently divorced with a 4-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. According to Amanda, she and Brian went home together after the party, but the relationship ended there. Then in February, Amanda discovered that she was pregnant. According to the family, Amanda had met with Brian to tell him that she was pregnant and asked if he wanted to be a part of the baby's life. He said that he did not want to be involved with the baby and offered to pay for an abortion. Amanda wanted to have the baby and did not consider this an option. Amanda arranged to meet Brian again in August, just weeks before she was due to give birth. It is not known what conversation or interaction took place between them that day because she was not seen or heard from since. Amanda's car was found parked outside the Hillsborough Civic Center, where she had met with Brian previously. A set of sonogram photos were found inside the car. Brian Westfall has not spoken to the police or media since 2005 and denied that Amanda's child was his. Though Westfall has been the prime suspect for many years, there's never been enough evidence to charge him. Then, in December 2021, just as police were apparently coming closer to charging Westfall, he suddenly died of a stroke in his home.
The FBI had recently put up electronic billboards about Amanda Jones' case, offering up to a $20,000 reward. Jones was 8.5 months pregnant when she disappeared. She left behind a daughter who was 4 years old at the time, now 20. Brian Westfall was the father of Jones's unborn child, and he'd met with Jones right before she disappeared. It was a meeting to discuss the baby. This afternoon, Jones' family issued a statement saying, "The sudden death of Brian Westfall has shocked all of us beyond belief. We as a family feel cheated that Brian has died before we could find our daughter Amanda and unborn grandson Hayden." Jones' family went on to express condolences to Brian Westfall's parents, saying the Westfall family can lay their child to rest in a sacred place. Quote, "We still have not had that opportunity."
Amanda's family continue to hope and search for answers. There is still a $100,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest or the discovery of Amanda's remains. Number 3. George Norman Hayes. In 2019, the Toronto Cold Case Unit began dusting off unsolved cold cases from the 70s and 80s, re-examining them and putting out appeals to the public for more information. Among the strangest and perhaps most frustrating of these cases is the disappearance of George Norman Hayes. In November 1978, George Norman Hayes was 22 years old when he left his parents' home for a doctor's appointment and was never seen or heard from again. He never arrived at his doctor's appointment, and he was reported missing by his parents the next day. The case had sat cold for decades. No one knew what happened to the young man. When the case was reopened in 2019, it was discovered that there were likely answers available to detectives at the time of George's disappearance. Reports of a man's body that was found later in March of 1979, just a few months after George's disappearance, in Lake Ontario, near the mouth of the Oswego River. According to the records, this John Doe had a tattoo of a devil holding a pitchfork with Mandarin written underneath it. Hayes' sister Dolores knew that the tattoo belonged to her brother. The mystery might have easily ended there, allowing George's family to formally identify him and properly put him to rest. Hayes' body may have also provided clues as to whether his death was an accident or suicide, or may have involved foul play. And while it seemed as though the Toronto police were helpful and invested in the case, the body was technically found on the American side of Lake Ontario. Bizarrely, New York authorities seemed baffled as to where the body ended up, suggesting that it may have been buried in an unmarked grave in a nearby cemetery. They also no longer had the photos that had supposedly been taken of George's telltale tattoo, claiming they had been lost in a recent flooding. To this day, it is unclear how this John Doe had been missed when Toronto detectives were looking for George. It seems like the bureaucratic red tape was the only thing in between solving George's cold case. However, if it wasn't George's body, it still was someone, and it's heartbreaking that there could be two families who may never have the answers because of carelessness when handling a deceased victim. New York law enforcement has no idea where the John Doe was ultimately buried. George's parents have passed now, but his siblings and other family members continue to search for answers. They've been fighting back and forth with Toronto law enforcement and their American counterparts to locate and determine if this John Doe is George. Anyone with any additional information on the case is being encouraged to contact the Toronto police. Number 4. Dorothy Arnold. For our last case, we have the oldest unsolved missing persons case on the Charlie Project. The Charlie Project is one of the largest public cold case websites that catalogs unsolved and missing person cases. It was founded in 2001 by the Doe Network founder, Jennifer Mara. It has been run since then as a public catalog and a resource I often use when doing research for cases. would love if you guys showed them some love and gave them a follow on Twitter. I think it would be really cool if we just en masse gave them a huge boost of support. Anyways, on to the case. The oldest missing persons cold case takes place in 1910. On December 12, 1910, 25-year-old socialite and heiress Dorothy Arnold disappeared while she'd been out running errands. She had told her mother she was going to go buy a new evening gown. Her mother offered to accompany her, but Dorothy declined. She left around 11 a.m. and was due to return for dinner. She was last seen at 1:45 p.m. by a shop clerk at Park and Tilford's candy store. He said that she bought some candy and seemed in high spirits. She bought a book at Brentano's, and it was there that she bumped into a friend, and the two chatted for a few minutes. She told her friend that she was going to go walk through Central Park and meet her mother for lunch at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Both the clerk at the bookstore and her friend reported she seemed fine and nothing out of the ordinary stood out. Her parents believe that she may have been carrying $25 to $30. In today's value, that would be around $700 to $900. This wasn't a normal amount of money, but it would have been if she was to purchase an evening gown that day. Dorothy was well educated, she spoke several languages, and hoped to become a writer. Her father was a renowned luxury importer, bringing in some of the finest European wares to the New York elite. Her uncle was a Supreme Court Justice, Rufus F. Peckham. At 25, the unmarried Dorothy still lived at home with her parents. There had apparently been some issues regarding Dorothy's living situation. She wanted to move into an apartment in Manhattan, but her father forbade it. This would have been very abnormal for a young unmarried woman to live alone at the time. Dorothy didn't seem like she was in a rush to settle down. She was last seen at the bookstore, and from there she seems to have vanished. It also didn't appear that she had visited anywhere that would have sold or made dresses that day. She missed dinner that night, which was out of character for Dorothy, and although her parents were worried, they didn't do anything yet. By the next evening, they were more concerned and hired private investigators to track down their daughter. They didn't want to go to the police as they didn't want to cause any sort of scandal. They didn't know why or what happened with Dorothy, and while they were concerned, it didn't seem as though they felt that anything bad had happened. They were more concerned with maintaining her reputation. There had been a situation the previous year with another prominent New York family. Adele Boas was 13 and disappeared. There had been a massive manhunt for the teen, and it was later discovered that she had run away with a boy to Boston. She was later found and returned home, and the family had been scandalized and shamed in the newspapers. Perhaps because Dorothy had wanted to live on her own and live more independently, her parents assumed that may have been what happened in this situation. Her bedroom didn't show any signs of a young woman about to run away. All her personal belongings were there still. The PI looked in jails, hospitals, and morgues across New York City, Philadelphia, and Boston. When the first PI came up empty-handed, they hired another one. This team of detectives interviewed her friends, and they went as far as checking hundreds of marriage licenses in Europe, as there was a theory that she'd run off to elope. 5 weeks of searching had led to no sign of Dorothy, and eventually her parents contacted the New York City Police Department. They held a press conference, and her father offered a $1,000 reward, around $30,000 in today's value. It was later discovered that Arnold had met a man while she was in college in Pennsylvania. The two had been secretly seeing each other, and when her family found out about it, they forbade Dorothy from seeing him again, as they didn't feel he was a suitable husband. His name was George Grissom Jr., and he had been on holiday in Italy with his parents when Dorothy had disappeared and denied knowing where she was. Also discovered was that Dorothy had a secret P.O. box, but that was likely for her writing career. Her first manuscript had been rejected by a magazine, and when it came to her family home, they had poked fun at her writing career. After that, it appeared that she got a P.O. box to have correspondence delivered relating to her writing submissions. Dorothy's disappearance became international news. Her pictures were in newspapers all over the US and Europe. The reward money had sent more than one on a mission to find the young woman. After a 75-day investigation, the NYC-PD declared Dorothy Arnold deceased. While there were numerous sightings and reports of people claiming to be the missing young woman, nothing panned out as a credible lead. The Arnold family received 2 ransom notes, but the alleged kidnappers were just hoping to scam the family. There are several theories about what might have happened. Her boyfriend claimed that she had been depressed about all the rejected manuscripts, and he believed that she had committed suicide. Another theory is that Dorothy had been pregnant, sought an illegal abortion, and died in the process. There had been a doctor in Pennsylvania that had a basement clinic raided when several young women disappeared after visiting it. A doctor who had worked there said that it was common practice to burn bodies of patients that died of complications, and said Dorothy may have been one of those victims. Her father, Francis Arnold, had reported to have spent $250,000 trying to find his daughter. He died in 1922, never knowing what happened to her. He was so sure she was dead that he left her out of his will. Her mother, Mary Arnold, died in 1928. It was said that she remained hopeful her daughter was alive and well for the rest of her life. In a case that is now well over 100 years old, it still bears similarities to modern ones. Devastated families are left in the wake of a missing person, families that deserve answers for their loved ones. And like I always say, you never know who's watching. Any sort of coverage can unlock a key piece of evidence needed to close one of these cold cases. Number 1. Tammy Corinne Terrell. On October 5, 1980, in Henderson, Nevada, the body of a young woman was found in a remote desert area. The young woman was estimated to be between the ages of 17 and 19. She had been found without any clothing, a purse, or identification. She was 5'2", 102 pounds, with light brown hair and blue eyes. Sketches were done of the unknown Jane Doe and circulated around the state, but no one came forward to identify her. Eventually, the Henderson Police Department gave her the moniker Jane Aurora Grand Doe for the area she was found in. Fingerprint and dental characteristics were logged with national databases. A description included references to a crude, apparently amateur S tattoo made with blue ink on the inside of her right forearm. She had pierced ears, a vaccination scar on her left bicep, and had dental work done in the past. She had died from blunt force trauma, and her death was ruled as a homicide. According to local police, she had been stabbed and beaten to death, possibly with a hammer. She had facial injuries, multiple head wounds, and puncture or stab wounds on her back. One of her teeth had even been knocked out. She'd been in the desert for less than 24 hours before her body was discovered. Despite best efforts from law enforcement, they weren't able to locate anyone that recognized the Jane Doe and really had no way of solving her murder. The lead detective on her case, who had been with her since her discovery, had vowed to see her case through. He and his wife had even covered the cost of her burial. Her case quickly went cold and eventually was closed altogether. In 2015, detectives at the Henderson PD were going through unsolved cold cases and decided to give the Aurora Grand Jane Doe case another look. They reached out to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who had experts make an artistic rendering and began to circulate the image. They also exhumed her grave in order to get a fresh DNA sample. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 2021, and that same year they received their first advance in the case in 40 years. Jane Doe's DNA had a direct familial match. They reached out to that person, who ended up being Jane Doe's sibling, and after 4 decades they had an identification: Tammy Terrell. Tammy Terrell disappeared from Roswell, New Mexico back in 1980. She was a troubled teen living in Roswell in a foster home with her 4 sisters. Despite the rough start she'd had in life, she was trying to turn her life around. On the night of her disappearance, her foster parents had dropped her off at the Eastern New Mexico Fairgrounds in Roswell with another girl. When they returned to pick her up, Tammy was not there. According to authorities, she was last seen at a restaurant near the fairgrounds with a man and a woman.
She was missing, but she was right there, just right there.
Tammy Terrell was one of 4 sisters who grew up in a foster home. Carla Clontz was the youngest, just 13, when Tammy went missing.
You're always looking for that face.
She says when Tammy was reported missing, last seen in a restaurant after the Roswell State Fair in 1980, local police didn't care.
The police said that she was 17 and had ran away for a couple of times, and she was almost going to be 18, so they're not going to look for her. So they didn't.
But Carla did look everywhere she went for 41 years.
Her birthday's on the 4th of July, so, every 4th of July, you're wondering and you're missing her. It's not a true celebration with her missing. And, we would always look in crowds. We would look in, at homeless people in their faces, trying to look to see if she's one of them.
Tammy's sisters never stopped looking for her, and the lead detective that had originally worked her case was at the press conference when her identification was announced. Police agencies in Nevada and southeast New Mexico are working together to find out who killed Tammy and how she ended up in Nevada. Roswell police are actively seeking leads for anyone who might have seen Tammy on the night in 1980 or knows anything about her disappearance. Anyone with information on the Tammy Terrell case is asked to contact Henderson Police Department or Crime Stoppers. Number 2, Pamela Darlene Young. On May 21, 2002, near Highway 135, just outside of Liberty, Texas, archaeologists collecting soil samples made a grisly discovery. They found a human skull and a partial skeleton remains in an open field near Swamp City Road. The medical examiner determined the remains belonged to a Hispanic or white woman between the ages of 16 and 30 and determined that the remains had been there for at least 2 years. Because the remains had been exposed to the elements for so long, it was difficult to determine the cause of death. There was no additional evidence found near the remains and nothing to identify the woman, and the case went cold before it could even begin. The case was re-examined in 2013, where the skull was scanned for 3D reconstruction. It was then that they discovered the victim had a cleft palate. They sent out the rendering to various government agencies and attempted to match it to a missing persons case in Texas. They sent out the rendering to various government agencies and attempted to match it to missing persons cases in Texas, but nothing came up. In 2019, the DNA Doe Project was contacted to help determine who the remains belonged to using genetic genealogy research. After 2 years, they traced her direct maternal line back to a family located in Virginia and North Carolina. They also discovered that the family had a daughter who had moved to Texas and had a cleft palate. Law enforcement had never been able to locate that woman, who would have been 27 back in the late 90s, and there weren't any records of her after 1998, making officers confident that the remains belonged to Pamela Darlene Young. Pamela had never been reported missing by her family. She had relocated to Texas after falling out with family members. Chief Deputy Craig Harrington with the Greggs County Sheriff's Department said there are no leads in this case, but they are still hoping to find information about what happened to Pamela. They still have no idea how Pamela came to be in an open field, and no cause of death was ever determined. But they did reveal they have a person of interest. However, they have been deceased since 2017. Anyone with information about Pamela, particularly if anyone knew her when she lived in Texas, is asked to call the Sheriff's Criminal Investigation Division or the Greggs County Crime Stoppers Division. Number 3, Brenda Marie Giroux. On April 8, 1981, a young woman's body was found near the Pima County Fairgrounds in Arizona by a group riding off-road vehicles. Her body had been dumped along a dirt road. Detectives said it appeared that the woman had been sexually assaulted and suffered a violent death. She had been in the desert for a couple of days before she was discovered. No identification could be found for the young woman. She was described as blonde with delicate facial features, 18 to 20 years old, 5'3", and a small frame. She was wearing a navy blue blouse with red sleeves and a floral print, blue jeans, white ankle socks with pom-poms, and brown suede shoes. 2 jackets were also found near her body, one a blue denim with red and white stripes on the cuffs and collar, and the other a blue rain jacket. They did a sketch of the woman, but no one came forward, and she was given the name Pima County Jane Doe. For 3 decades, that was all she was known as. In 2012, detectives decided to reopen her investigation and gather new evidence. Her body was exhumed, DNA evidence was taken, and investigators also took the opportunity to create a 3D rendering of her skull to get a better idea of what she may have looked like. In 2014, it was determined that the reconstruction closely matched a potential unknown victim from an inmate in Arizona, John Kalhauser, who was serving 26 years and had taken a no-contest plea regarding his wife's disappearance. The photograph had been in his wallet when he was arrested, and he would never reveal who the young woman was. Law enforcement paired the photograph with the reconstruction and sent it through social media all over the country, hoping someone would recognize her. Eventually, cold case detectives got in contact with Bill Giroux, who thought the reconstruction might be his sister. He wanted to get ruled out, still hoping his beloved sister was still alive. 20-year-old Brenda Giroux had been missing since 1981. Originally from Nashua, New Hampshire, she had left on a road trip with her boyfriend, John Kalhauser. Bill and Brenda had grown up in foster care, and they were all each other had for family. Brenda was a few years older than he was, and he remembered how mad he was when Brenda told him she was going to California. He didn't want to be left behind, but Brenda assured him she wasn't going to abandon him. The two had kept in contact for the first few weeks after she left. She'd called him first from New Mexico, and she sent him an envelope of turquoise. Her last call had been from Arizona, where she had seemed upset, and told Bill that she was coming home. When he asked what was wrong, she didn't say. It had been a short call, but she told him that she loved him before hanging up. That was the last time Bill spoke to his sister. The envelope of turquoise she had mailed him arrived several weeks later. Over the years, Bill had made several attempts to find his sister, but law enforcement didn't file a police report believing she wasn't a missing person. Another attempt informed him that they had made contact with Brenda, that she didn't want to be in contact with him, which had crushed him. To now know that after all these years she had been deceased was heartbreaking, but Brenda hadn't willingly left him behind. DNA confirmed Pima County Jane Doe was Brenda, and law enforcement brought that to John Kalhauser, who refused to acknowledge he knew Brenda. Bill said that he didn't know that John Kalhauser was a convicted murderer, and he thought Brenda didn't know either. He served 7 years in prison for killing a man when he was only 17. He had also shot the lover of his fiancée in 1979. That man had survived 3 gunshot wounds, and Kalhauser had been charged with armed assault with intent to murder. He was out on bond when he met Brenda. The two had met in a bar that Brenda was working at. Eventually, he convinced her to take a trip with him to California. But what he didn't tell her was that he was skipping out on his parole. Bill remembered his final goodbye with Brenda. She had jumped on the back of Kalhauser's motorcycle, and the two set off. John Kalhauser stayed in Arizona. He started going by the name Donald Stechy, which had been the name of a classmate he'd gone to school with in elementary school. He got married to Diane Van Reeth, and the couple had 2 children together. In '95, Diane filed for divorce and sole custody of the children. On August 10, 1995, Diane left home from work and was never seen again. Kalhauser was arrested in regards to her disappearance, and it was then discovered that he was going by an assumed name. When law enforcement connected him to his real name, they found the warrant in Massachusetts for his arrest. He was extradited back to Massachusetts to serve 29 years for the assault of his former fiance's boyfriend. He was also charged with Diane's murder in '99. Her body was never found. Kalhauser is scheduled for release in 2025. Authorities are building a case against Kalhauser for the murder of Brenda Giroux. Anyone with information is asked to reach out to the Gregg County Crime Stoppers. Number 4. Kimberly Raina Jones. On September 28, 2016, a new girl's body was found in a ravine near the White Hills area of Arizona, near Highway 93 in Dolan Springs, close to the Nevada border. Due to the body decomposition, an identification or cause of death could not be made at that time. Authorities shared a composite sketch on social media, but nobody responded. She was described as 5'5" with a slight frame, black hair that was worn in a natural curly style. Her eye color was dark, and they estimated, based on her bone structure, that she was African American, biracial, or Hispanic. In 2020, the case was re-examined and the body was exhumed for new DNA samples. By July 2021, they had matched from a relative that had submitted their DNA with the missing persons report in California. Mojave Jane Doe was identified as missing teen Kimberly Reyes Jones. Kimberly Reyes Jones was 18 at the time of her disappearance and was reported missing from San Bernardino, California. The investigation into Kimberly's disappearance and murder is ongoing. Law enforcement still doesn't know how Kimberly got to Arizona.
Developing tonight, the body of a California teen who went missing 5 years ago was just identified by authorities in Arizona. The body of 18-year-old Kimberly Reyes Jones was found in Dolan Springs, that's in Mojave County, Arizona, in September of 2016. They were just able to identify her after collecting another DNA sample from her last year and sending it to an outside lab. Jones was reported missing from San Bernardino in 2017. Because of decomposition, investigators could not figure out how she died.
Authorities urge anyone with information about Jones to contact the Mojave County Special Investigations Unit or call Crime Stoppers. Well, that is it. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more recently solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 1. Lena Reyes Gidis. On April 20th, 1998, a couple was hiking in Maidenwater Spring when they came across something on Highway 276 in Garfield County, Utah. They found a body, and both Park Services and the Garfield County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene. They found a woman wrapped in plastic bags, duct taped, put in a blue sleeping bag, then rolled in a carpet tied with rope. Authorities believed she had been strategically placed to be found. During the autopsy, she was determined to have been between 32 and 45 years old, with brown hair and brown eyes. She weighed approximately 110 pounds. She had been shot in the back of the head execution style, and the killer had removed the tips of the fingers post-mortem. It was also noted that the body had frozen due to the below-freezing temperatures the day before the body had been found. Authorities had not been able to identify the victim. She would be called Maidenwater victim Jane Doe, and the case would go cold. The case would eventually be handed to the Utah State Bureau of Investigation. Utah Bureau agent Brian Davies did a press conference in 2018 trying to identify the Maidenwater Jane Doe. In October 2018, the Utah Department of Public Safety released a press conference asking for help identifying the victim. This press release also stated that they had considered serial killer Scott Kimball as a suspect and had yet to rule him out. This case had similarities to Kimball's other victims, but he denied involvement. Unknown to the Utah authorities, but around the same time as this press release, Ohio authorities were updating pictures of their missing persons database. A California true crime enthusiast saw the pictures of the missing person database and felt the connection to photos that had been released of the Maidenwater victim. He got in contact with Davies, saying that he should look into this missing person case. They reviewed both cases, and both Davies and the Ohio authorities confirmed that they looked very similar and had a similar mole. They believed they might have found the victim's identity and had 2 family members come up and take DNA tests. In a November 28 press release 20 years after the body was found, the Utah DPS confirmed the victim as missing 37-year-old Lena Reyes Gidis. Lena had gone missing in 1998. When she left for a trip from her home with her husband, Edward Gidis, to visit family in Mexico. She was supposed to travel through a Texas airport, but there was no record of her ever getting on any flights that day. She was reported missing 5 months later by her husband. Lena was a ballerina when she first met her husband in New Mexico, and they got married in '96 and moved to Youngstown, Ohio 6 months later. Now that they had identified Lena, they kept working on who her killer might be. Davis started looking back at the evidence, specifically at the rope she'd been tied in. With advances in DNA, they could use a technology that allowed them to extract DNA from a difficult surface, like a rope. They did find 2 male samples of DNA. One was ruled out as the knot expert they had used previously to see if a special knot had been used. The other sample made them look back at Lena's husband, Edward. In 1998, Lena's husband had been the primary suspect during her disappearance, because it had taken so long for her to be reported missing. He was brought in for questioning with law enforcement in October of '98, where he talked about a blue sleeping bag she was bringing as a gift, the last time he had seen her dropping her off at the airport, saying he didn't go in with her, and that she was planning on paying for the reserved ticket in cash.
The morning, Wednesday morning, April 8th.
When she made the reservations from Pittsburgh, she made it from the house, she called?
Yeah.
Do you know what flight company, what plane?
I thought it was a U.S. Air flight that I gave you.
U.S. Air. Now, at that point, she made the reservations. Did she pay for the ticket? How did she pay for the ticket?
She was going to pay cash for the ticket at the airport.
Okay. No, okay, so you made reservations and then you
I told her to take credit card if she would take the credit card.
Unfortunately, Edward took his own life in 2001. Davies could not get a sample as he had been cremated after his death. Authorities then reached out to his living relatives asking for DNA samples. 2 came forward willingly and 1 had to get a search warrant. The DNA came back as a familial match. In June of 2022, law enforcement announced that the case was closed and that they had discovered Lena's killer, her husband, Edward Gidis. After 20 years, she got her name back, and after 24 years, her family got to know what happened and who killed her. In a January 2019 press release, Lena's sister is quoted saying, "I'm very grateful for all your work. I felt like for 20 years no one would listen to me, but now I know what happened. I'm here to bring her home, not like I expected, but I'm bringing her back home with me." Number 2. Benny Scruggs. On July 17, 1985 at 3 a.m., a man called 911 from a trailer home on Travis Drive in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, saying that his neighbor had been stabbed. He was still alive, but was bleeding heavily. The 911 dispatcher told him that they should put pressure on the wound and help was on the way. During the phone call, the neighbor said that the wife of the man who'd been stabbed had called him and asked for him to come over there quickly. He told the dispatcher that he was holding a knife. The dispatcher said to put it down. This was when the dispatcher could hear a female voice saying, "One of my knives is missing," and the man told the woman, "Hey Yvonne, go back there and apply pressure." When the Wisconsin Rapids police arrived, they found a man identified by the wife as Benny Scruggs on a waterbed of the trailer home covered in blood with a towel over the wound. When the ambulance arrived, the man was pronounced deceased at the scene. Benny Scruggs was 28 years old. He married Yvonne Koshaw on May 15, 1982, and they had one son together named Matthew. He worked as a baker at the Foodland East. An autopsy was performed with the cause of death being a single stab wound to the chest on the upper left-hand side. The wound had gone through his rib, into his lung, and almost out the back. The medical examiner was quoted as saying, "One hell of a big knife, like a butcher knife, and another 3/4 of an inch, and there would have been a hole in the waterbed." Police at the time interviewed surrounding neighbors, Yvonne, and the Scruggs' babysitter. The couple had been out the night before, and the babysitter had reported that they came home in better spirits than average around 1 a.m. On the other hand, during her 3 interviews that evening, Yvonne would give different versions of what had happened. During her first interview with detectives, Yvonne said that the babysitter had left, then she and Benny went to bed, him falling asleep right away, and her lying awake. Then their 2-year-old son was crying. She went to his room for about 10 minutes before feeling something was off. When she went back to bed, she noticed a shovel was up against the fridge and the trailer door was open. That was strange because she always had a habit of locking the door. She then went to look for Benny and found him covered in blood. She then called the neighbor for help. In a second interview, only a few hours after the first, she said that they both fell asleep after the babysitter left and that their 2-year-old came into their bedroom crying. She then took the toddler to his bedroom for about 10 minutes and then noticed the shovel and the open back door on the way back. I checked in on Benny and then called the neighbor for help. During the second interview, Yvonne had stepped away for a moment. A detective overheard her talking to her friend, with her stating, "I was asleep next to him, he got stabbed, I don't know." During her final interview, she had said that they both fell asleep. She woke up to her 2-year-old crying and Benny throwing up. She took her son to his room and then went back to Benny. He was covered in blood and she called the neighbor. Detectives at the time believed that she was being uncooperative with their investigation. Police decided to drain a nearby pond in hopes of finding the missing murder weapon, but they did not find it in the pond. The alleged knife that Yvonne claimed was missing from the home was never found. Over the next few weeks, the authorities would interview neighbors, including Donald Meyer, who lived in a trailer just down the way with a woman and her child. Meyer would tell authorities that he'd previously had a sexual relationship with Yvonne when they worked together 4 or 5 years earlier. He also told police that Yvonne had a temper and that she probably killed her husband. He would continue to tell the police that he had not seen Yvonne again till the February of 1985, and that was about a week before Benny was stabbed. Yvonne had invited him over, Benny was not home, and they had sexual intercourse in the living room. And it was then that Yvonne had told him that if he wanted her, he knew how to get rid of Benny. Yvonne, in an August 1985 police interview, would confirm the sexual relationship with Meyer, saying that she didn't tell the police because she didn't think it was important, and that she was embarrassed to tell anyone. She did, however, deny saying anything about getting rid of Benny. After 1993, the case would go dormant until 2012. At that time, Donald Meyer would stack up a lengthy criminal history, and Yvonne would go on to get remarried. Donald Meyer was on trial for 10 counts of stalking jurors who had convicted him in a 2006 trial for threatening a judge. Knowing this would mean adding time to his sentence, he reached out to the Wisconsin Police Department and asked to speak to someone about Benny Scruggs' murder. In this interview, Meyer would implicate Yvonne, saying that she was trying to set him up for Benny's murder. He would also go on to say that he'd been over multiple times and that one time she took him into the bedroom so his fingerprints would be there. He also drew an intricate diagram of the trailer and knew facts about it, like the bedroom door would open and the trailer's back door was screwed shut. After this interview, detectives would interview other people who were around at the time of the murder. Some will remember talking to Yvonne about the murder in the following weeks or years. One witness said Yvonne had told them that she knew who killed Benny. And another said Yvonne had asked if she thought she had killed him, the witness asking, "Well, did you?" And Yvonne never answered. Another witness came forward after seeing an article in a newspaper in 2013 about Benny Scruggs' murder, saying her son had dated Yvonne between 1989 and 1990 while she was married to her new husband, who is now deceased. The witness said Yvonne said she loved both men, with the witness saying something like, "You can't have it both ways." According to them, Yvonne's answer was, "I killed one husband, I can kill another." The son, who was also in this interview, said that he had asked where the father of her child was, her answer being, "He's not with us anymore." He asked what happened, and she answered, "Well, I killed him." She also said that she was drunk that night and didn't remember much. In 2013, detectives interviewed some of Meyer's fellow inmates. Those inmates said that Meyer liked to talk about how he'd been in an ongoing relationship with Yvonne around the time of the murder, that Yvonne had instructed him to throw the murder weapon in the garbage so it would be picked up in the morning by trash collection. Yvonne died in 2015 of acute alcohol poisoning and was never formally accused or charged with murder. More years would pass before any further progress on Benny Scruggs' murder investigation. In 2017, an inmate would tell detectives that Meyer had told him he had committed the murder, that he had done it because Yvonne had refused to be with him till her husband was dead. The same inmate had overheard him talking to someone on the phone about the murder. Police obtained the recording of the phone call. In 2022, Donald Meyer, now 60 years old, was charged with the murder of Benny Scruggs. In September 2022, he refused to come out of his cell for his preliminary hearing and refused to work with his public defender. In December, Meyer's public defender tried to get him a new preliminary hearing, but the judge said that they would not reward bad behavior. Meyer was present for this hearing and pleaded not guilty. His trial is currently set up for a video conference in April 2023. It is during this trial we will find out what evidence law enforcement has against Meyer. However, regardless of the circumstances, he either perpetrated the murder or helped Yvonne cover up a murder case for 4 decades. Number 3. Jennifer Brinkman. On March 24, 1998, in Marysville, Washington, a father returned home from vacation with his girlfriend to find his 19-year-old daughter deceased in her bedroom. The girl was Jennifer Brinkman, who was supposed to be on this vacation, but last minute had decided to stay home. An autopsy would later show that she'd been hit in the neck by an axe. News reports from '98 would say that they didn't find the murder weapon, but more recent reports say that the axe was found at the crime scene. Authorities at the time also collected other evidence and DNA samples. Jennifer was described as a social person known to walk around Marysville, to strike up conversations with strangers. She often used telephone, dating, and chat lines, which were used frequently in the 90s, to chat and connect with strangers. She was also known to use library computers to access online chat rooms. The Marysville Police Department would send in the evidence to the crime lab, but they were unable to get any matches to anything, and DNA was not as advanced as it is today. Jennifer's case would eventually go cold, and the case would move from detective to detective, but the Marysville police never forgot her. As DNA advanced, they were able to get a DNA sample that didn't belong to Jennifer, individual A, but they didn't have anyone to compare the sample to. The Marysville Police Department eventually partnered with Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs. They would use genetic genealogy and publicly offered profiles to find a potential list of suspects. One of these suspects had already been on their radar for years. The suspect had been a person of interest Jennifer had talked to on one of the chat lines, and the suspect had sent a letter to Jennifer just prior to her death. But when the suspect had previously interviewed earlier in the investigation, he denied ever knowing or having contact with Jennifer. With this advanced DNA analysis, they could get a search warrant for the suspect's DNA. With the warrant, he volunteered his DNA willingly, and it was an exact match. He was arrested in November 2022 with first-degree murder. In November, the Marysville Police Department held a press conference announcing that they had arrested a suspect, a 52-year-old man. They did not reveal his name at that time. The police said that they are still getting all of the pieces together. In this press conference, they said that the letter had wording that implied that they had met before. The suspect lived only 3 miles from Jennifer's mother's house, but they didn't know if they had met in the past while Jennifer visited her mother. The suspect would have been 28 years old at the time of Jennifer's murder. They said that the suspect had used his right to remain silent, and that they may never get an answer to the motive. Since the murder, he has worked and lived as a hermit, and he is not suspected in any other murders, nor evidence that he is connected to any other crimes. After 24 years, they could tell Jennifer's mother that they had found who did this. The press conference revealed that Jennifer's mother was extremely emotional. She cried and was very thankful for the work that was put into her case. Jennifer's father passed away in 2013. There may never be answers as to why this happened, but the family can hopefully find some justice for Jennifer. The suspect is currently being held on charges of first-degree murder in Snohomish County Jail. At this time, there are no further announcements on the next court dates or when his identity will be released to the public. Number 1. Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. On June 3, 1993, a woman's body was found on the side of the westbound Pacheco Pass Highway near Gilroy, California, by a truck driver who had stopped to take a break. She had been wearing blue jeans, a blue t-shirt, and a blue jacket. She was severely decomposed at the time of the discovery. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department did an autopsy at the time, which put the cause of death as undetermined. They could not identify the victim at the time, and she was given the name Blue Pacheco Jane Doe for what she was wearing and where she was found. This Jane Doe would get justice before we would ever know her name. A serial killer, Keith Hunter Jesperson, or known as the Happy Face Killer, sent a letter to the Santa Clara County District Attorney in 1997 describing how he dumped a woman on the side of the road on Route 152. But it would not be until 2006 that he would be charged with the death of the Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. There's not much information as to why it took so long, but he confessed in court in 2007 and her death was added to his life sentence. Keith Hunter Jesperson is a Canadian-American serial killer who killed at least 8 women in the early 90s. He is nicknamed the Happy Face Killer for how he signed letters to newspapers before he was arrested. If you want me to cover Jesperson, please comment below. In 2019, the Sheriff's Department ramped up its efforts to identify Blue Pacheco Jane Doe. They used genetic genealogy and the DNA Doe Project's help to find a relative of the Jane Doe. They got hits all over North America. They contacted authorities all over the US and Canada to connect with potential family members in the hopes of finally identifying her. In 2021, they found a likely candidate, and by April 2022, Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office announced they had successfully identified the Blue Pacheco Jane Doe as Patricia Patsy Skipple. Patsy was a mother and would have been 45 years old at the time of her death. She had gone missing from Molalla, Oregon in 1992 when she left her home one morning and never returned. In a press release, the Sheriff's Office stated, quote, "Although this criminal case was adjudicated, detectives never gave up as they worked diligently throughout this investigation to provide closure to the family of Patricia Skipple." The Sheriff's Office also thanked the DNA Doe Project, Oregon State Police Criminal Investigation Division, including Detective Jim O'Connor, and the Calgary Police Service, including Detective Ken Carrier and analyst Amy Lameau, for their help throughout this investigation. Number 2. Jane Doe, 1985. On December 16, 1985, 2 hunters found human remains in a field 50 yards off the junction of County Road 50 and County Road 90 in Pearlsland, Texas. The remains were discovered to be female, believed at the time to be Hispanic, and they determined the death occurred 6 to 12 months before the remains were discovered. There was never much released about the death, but it had been ruled a homicide, and the female victim was never identified. The Doe Network reports the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. On October 6, the Brazoria County Sheriff's Office got a DNA report that stated they had found the match for the 1985 Jane Doe. She was identified as missing teen Alicia Lisa Marie Cooks. Alicia had been reported missing by her family in Houston, Texas in the summer of 1985. This would put her time of death closer to 6 months when her remains were found. The Cooks family had come forward recently and given samples of DNA that were uploaded to NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, in hopes of finding any information about where she might be, and this is how they managed to identify Alicia Cooks. Her brother Byron Parker is pictured with the police and Brazoria County Sheriff's Office press release announcing the identification of Alicia Cooks. In this press release, a letter stated, quote, "The family was given some closure as Alicia was identified and found after 36 years. Her murder investigation remains open and they are still looking for anyone with information on this case. You're asked to contact the Brazoria County Sheriff's Office or call the Brazoria County Crime Stoppers." Number 3. Boy in a Box. It was on February 25, 1957 that would start the oldest homicide cold case worked by the Philadelphia Police Department. A college student was out in the woods in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when he stumbled upon a cardboard box. Inside the box was what he believed was a doll, but upon further inspection, he realized it was the body of a small child. The little boy had been severely beaten and malnourished. His blonde hair had been cut in a haphazard manner, and his fingernails were trimmed short. He was unclothed but wrapped in a small plaid blanket. His age was estimated to be between 4 and 6. Experts felt he'd only been deceased for a few days, and detectives felt it would be a quick case to solve. Little evidence was found near the crime scene. The box itself had likely been picked up from the area. There had been a cap found nearby, but there was little to identify the wearer. Despite national coverage of the case, no one came forward to identify the little boy. He was given the moniker Boy in a Box, but was later given the kinder name of America's Unknown Child. For decades, his cold case was reopened, closed, evidence retested, closed. Detectives who had worked the original case retired, and the case was passed down to multiple generations of detectives. For over 6 decades, this went on. And as time went on, few believed there would ever be answers. In 2019, Philly PD petitioned the courts asking for permission to exhume his body and use genetic genealogy to attempt to identify him. That petition was approved, and DNA was retrieved from his remains. Since then, genealogists have been working to reverse engineer his family tree, and on December 8, 2022, detectives made an announcement. America's unknown child had his name returned, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Joseph was nearly 4 years old when he died. Joseph has multiple living siblings. His parents are deceased. Law enforcement is not releasing information about his parents in order to protect the privacy of the living siblings, but has stated that his parents were prominently known in Delaware. He had never been reported missing. The investigation for Joseph's murder remains ongoing. Philadelphia PD Captain Jason Smith said in a statement to the media, quote, "We may not make an arrest, we may never make an identification, but we're going to do our darndest to try. There remains a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest."
The unveiling of 2 headstones with the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli closes one chapter of arguably Philadelphia's most notorious cold case.
We've grown up knowing about the boy.
Patty Braxton and Kimberly Augustine's father was a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department. Thomas Augustine kept this case in the spotlight for years.
It's just bittersweet. It's my dad passed 6 weeks before they identified the boy, and this would mean the world to him.
It was devastating to us to find that, 6 weeks after he passed, he got a name, but we're grateful for that.
Joseph Zarelli's identity was revealed last month at a news conference. The boy lived his short life in the area of 63rd and Callow Hill Streets in West Philadelphia. His body was discovered in February 1957, discarded in a box in Fox Chase. He had been beaten and was malnourished. Investigators have since declined to say what they believe happened. Bill Fleischer of the Vidocq Society made a point to speak directly to surviving family members of Joseph Zarelli.
I want to thank the families, the surviving siblings and relatives of Joseph, who may not have known anything about this, who care and keep him in his prayers.
Some members of Joseph's family attended the service and spoke at length with reporters off camera, telling us they mourned for Joseph, but say they never knew anything about the investigation or even the case before last month's news conference. They told me they'll be persistent in keeping in contact with police so that perhaps they can someday have closure and know what happened.
Number 4, Patricia Gildewey. On September 27, 2001, construction workers in Fairfax, Virginia, discovered the skeletal remains near a drainage ditch. The remains were collected along with clothing and jewelry. The victim was roughly estimated to have been deceased for a long time, around 20 years, and the forensic examiner that looked over the remains said that the victim was an African-American woman who was 15 to 20 years old. Her cause of death was deemed a homicide, with a gunshot wound found to the back of the skull. Law enforcement had worked to identify the woman, but based on the description of the victim, nothing came up that led to a positive identification. Once all the investigative leads dried up, the case went cold. In early 2022, Fairfax County Police Department reopened the investigation and paired up with Orthram Labs to examine the DNA for fresh clues. Based on the DNA, they discovered the victim was Caucasian, and the DNA connected to a half-sister who had supplied her DNA years prior in hopes of finding answers for her missing sister. After 47 years, Patricia Agnes Gildewey's murder was one step closer to solving. Patricia went missing in 1975 and was 17 when she went missing. Her family, originally from France, came to the U.S. in 1958. The family had moved to Fairfax, Virginia in the early 70s. Her sister, Veronique Duperly, told law enforcement more about her sister. When she last saw Patricia on February 8, 1975, she'd been covered in bruises. Patricia was dating a man who was in his 30s, who Veronique had always believed had something to do with Patricia's death. She described Patricia as a free spirit who, as a teenager, didn't really want to live by anyone's rules. She said Patricia was sweet and would never hurt anyone, but had recently gotten involved with a rougher group of friends. Law enforcement has not released the name of Patricia's boyfriend, but has stated they will be looking to speak with him in regard to their relationship and her disappearance. They now believe that Patricia had been murdered close to the day that she had been reported missing by her family. Her murder investigation remains ongoing.
When I gave them my DNA, they sent it to the lab while they were sitting here in my living room, and they had 100% DNA match within 15 minutes.
Veronique Duperly describes the moment last month when Fairfax County detectives told her new DNA technology from a company called Othram had linked her Ancestry.com results to the unidentified woman. 1975 came flooding back. Shuby, the nickname everyone used for her younger sister Patricia Gildowie, had been found. Veronique says Shuby was dating an older man who loaned her a car, a white Cadillac Eldorado with red interior, similar to this one, that her younger sister was driving the last time she saw her. That was also the day she noticed the bruises.
Bruises on her upper arms, her shoulders, and the back of her legs, and I said, well, why are you so black and blue, and she said, well, I fall a lot. And I said, no, you don't.
Fairfax County police say they are anxious to talk to Shuby's boyfriend. They don't know his name, only that he was in his 30s at the time and worked at a now-closed upholstery store near Church Street and Lawyers Road in Vienna.
We're moving fast and furious on this case. We know the killer is still out there.
Police believe that there are still people alive, people who may be living in this area who have information about the murder of Shuby Gildowie. In McLean, Jackie Benson, News 4.
Today we're discussing a viewer-suggested case. This case seems to be solved yet unresolved, and it's the murder of Taylor McAllister. Let's get into it. In the early morning hours on December 22, 2016, a man was collecting cans in the alley on 63rd Avenue in St. Petersburg, Florida, when he stumbled upon something horrific. The lifeless body of a young female had been ditched in an alleyway behind some residential houses. She was wearing nothing but a gray t-shirt that was pulled up to her neck. She had bruises and cuts all over her body. Also, there were tire marks imprinted on her left arm and leg, indicating that she may have been run over. The police later identified the body as 22-year-old Taylor Ann McAllister, whose life had been cut too short by a ruthless killer, who to this day has never been brought to justice. Taylor was born in Melbourne, Florida on July 21, 1994, to Bill and Leslie McAllister. She was the second oldest of 5 children, and she was a happy and bubbly child who was known to love the beach, being out in the boat watching dolphins, and spending quality time with her family. She also had an amazing voice and discovered her passion for music at the age of 14. She taught herself how to play guitar and would spend hours learning different tunes and recording herself singing covers of some of her favorite songs.
I was special. You're so very special. But I'm a creep. I'm a weirdo. What the hell am I doing here? I don't belong here. I don't care if it hurts.
She also had a vibrant personality and a big heart. Taylor's mother described her as being the kind of person who you would meet once, and the next time she would give you the biggest hug and act as if she'd known you your whole life. Around the age of 18 in 2012, things took a darker turn for Taylor. She'd moved out on her own for the first time, but got mixed up with a group of friends that began to introduce her to things, and she started to experiment with pills. However, when she realized it was becoming a problem, she reached out. She told her parents the truth and asked to come home to remove herself from the situation. Her parents helped her, and she moved back in with them, and they didn't notice anything wrong, and they were grateful that they felt they had stepped in before things got bad. Eventually, she started doing well again, and she got a job as a waitress in a Japanese restaurant that was near her parents' house. It was there that she met and fell in love with a man named Josh. He worked for the Coast Guard. After only 3 months of dating, they got married. However, there was more to their love story than met the eye. Josh also struggled with drug addiction, and it was reported that the pair had decided to get married only after Josh was offered a job in Seattle so they could move away. During their time in Seattle, Taylor and Josh enabled each other's habits and got into a lot of harder drugs together. They had only lived in Seattle for a short time when Taylor called and told her parents that she was pregnant with twins. Taylor's parents moved her back to Florida so they could take care of her during the pregnancy. Once Taylor knew she was pregnant, she stopped doing everything cold turkey. In March 2014, she gave birth to her 2 beautiful twin girls. Taylor adored her baby girls and wanted the best version of herself for them. She planned on going to cosmetology school and starting her career. Unfortunately, though, she had to deliver them through C-section, and her doctor prescribed her Percocet for her recovery. After the birth of her twins, Taylor moved back in with her parents while her new husband stayed in Seattle. During that time, Taylor's mom, Leslie, noticed that Taylor was going through her pain meds faster than she should have. She kept calling the doctor for refills, and things only kept going downhill from there. With her getting sober for several months, but unfortunately, something would click and she would relapse. Eventually, her addiction started spiraling out of control, and the once bubbly, full of life young woman became the shell of herself. Her parents tried to help her get clean many times, but at 22 years old, Taylor was an adult who was free to do whatever she wanted, and they would soon realize they were fighting a losing battle. It was Taylor that needed to want to get sober. 2016 had started super promising. Taylor had been clean for months, and it seemed like things were starting to get normal for the family. However, by August, everything had changed, and she had started using heroin. Taylor's parents had to take custody of the twins and had to make the difficult decision to place an ultimatum on Taylor: get clean or stay away from your girls. The twins were now 2, and they were doing what they thought was best for the toddlers, as well as Taylor's younger sisters. Taylor and her husband were living in their car, both unable to keep steady jobs. Taylor would start resorting to sex work to support her habit. Taylor met a woman who introduced her to Backpage, a website that was supposed to be for classified ads. However, it was in fact the biggest marketplace for buying and selling sex. It was seized by the FBI in 2018 after investigators found it was a place where sex traffickers frequently placed ads. The woman, who acted like a friend, but in reality was more like a pimp, succeeded in making the whole ordeal sound much more innocent than it was. She convinced Taylor that all she had to do was model in swimsuits, then she would find men on the site who would be willing to buy her more swimsuits and pay for all her needs. Eventually, Taylor was introduced to a man named Robert Butler. He was more than twice her age, and he went by the name Bert, and was the son of Robert Butler Jr., the late founder of Bob's Carpet and Flooring. Butler had a lot of money to his name, and he allegedly became Taylor's dealer and was more than happy to supply her with the drugs she wanted in exchange for her company. In total, he spent nearly $200,000 on drugs. Despite coming from a wealthy family and being the heir to a renowned local chain, Bert was no stranger to the law. He had an extensive criminal record that included aggravated assault, battery, false imprisonment, carrying a gun at an airport, as well as multiple misdemeanors, including battery, drug paraphernalia charges, and 3 DUIs. In addition, he was connected to the overdose of a teenage girl in Manatee County. Butler took advantage of Taylor's addiction. When Taylor's husband went into treatment in October of 2016, she was left completely homeless. Butler convinced her to move into his home in Palm Harbor. It was reported that Butler was obsessed with Taylor, and he used her addiction to control her. He eventually confined her to his home and cut her off from all her friends and family. The last time Taylor's parents heard from her was in September of 2016, 3 months before her untimely death, where she wished her mother a happy birthday.
That's the last text. That's the last contact that I ever had with her.
3 days before Christmas, on December 22nd, 2016, Taylor's parents' worst nightmare came true when they were informed of the death of their beloved daughter. At 11:30 a.m., Leslie was at work as a paramedic when she heard the devastating news. Simultaneously, Bill received the news at home in person. The first thought that crossed their mind was that their daughter must have overdosed, but they were shocked to find that police were treating her death as a homicide. When Taylor's body was found, it appeared to be severely bruised as if she had been beaten, and there were cuts and scrapes within her mouth as if she'd been biting and struggling to breathe. There were also foreign DNA samples found under her fingernails and on her neck, as if she had scratched and fought against her attacker. Taylor's body was discovered 25 miles from where Butler lived. Also, all her friends and family said that she'd been living with him for months, so naturally, law enforcement paid him a visit. The detective who interviewed Butler at his Palm Harbor home stated that he had observed several scratches on Butler's forehead, nose, and forearms. He also had a fresh bruise on one of his shoulders. When detectives asked Butler for his DNA, he panicked and asked for a lawyer, so they had to obtain a warrant for the swab for his mouth. The results came back as a match. The DNA recovered from Taylor's body belonged to none other than Robert Butler.
The only person's DNA that was found on Taylor was Robert Butler's. On her neck and under her nails, he had fresh scratches to his face.
She had scratched him before she died. However, Butler was never charged or even brought into custody for further questioning. In addition, law enforcement didn't even obtain a search warrant for Butler's home, giving him an opportunity to destroy all the evidence that may have connected him to Taylor. They justified this by saying that the DNA evidence couldn't be used as proof of murder since Taylor and Butler lived together. And even though there were obvious signs of trauma found in Taylor's body, one of St. Petersburg's detectives tried to push the narrative that she'd only died of an overdose. Leslie had fought to see her daughter, but she wasn't allowed to until the body was released to a funeral home. Her family had been told there had been no physical signs of trauma, so they had opted to go with an open casket funeral. However, when Taylor's body arrived at the funeral home, they were shocked to discover that Taylor was covered in bruises and obvious injuries. Her mother described her body as looking beaten head to toe. She even went ahead and released autopsy photos of Taylor to discredit the SPPD's statements that Taylor had no obvious signs of trauma. But nearly 2 months after the discovery of the body, Taylor's autopsy results finally came out, revealing that her cause of death had been asphyxiation and ruling that the manner of death was, indeed, homicide. However, they couldn't determine exactly if she had been choked or smothered. But she had severe petechia on her eyes, neck, and chest. The medical examiner even stated that it was the worst case of petechia he had ever seen in his career. Her autopsy also revealed that she had many health issues related to her drug abuse. She had hepatitis, kidney damage, and bacterial growth on her heart valves, all side effects of chronic drug abuse. Yet, her toxicology scan showed that the drugs in her system were estimated to be a week old. Taylor hadn't died from a drug overdose, which the medical examiner concluded it wouldn't have been medically possible. Taylor's mom, Leslie, worked as a first responder, and she stated that through the office grapevine, there was a detective overheard calling Taylor a junkie whore only hours after the discovery of her body, before any toxicology results came back in. Taylor had a clean criminal record, so this officer had made several assumptions before even investigating the case. This led the McAllister family to believe that detectives working on Taylor's murder case weren't interested in solving her murder, and they certainly weren't the type of detectives they wanted on her case. Leslie filed a complaint and was successful in getting the detective removed from Taylor's case, but he still works in the department. The McAllister family feels that there had been a strong belief within the SPPD that Taylor's death would have been ruled an accidental overdose. Because of that, there hadn't been much of an initial investigation. Why had Taylor been found nearly naked in an alley 25 miles from where she was apparently living? She didn't have a car. How did she get there? Who had strangled her? Why did she have skin under her fingernails? And that DNA that had matched Butler, why hadn't they searched the property where they knew she was living at the time of her murder? All of these questions were left unanswered, and the SPPD only had excuses. Once Taylor's death was ruled a homicide, the McAllister family felt that the SPPD went into cover their ass mode, attempting to string together a murder investigation months later. According to St. Petersburg Police Major Shannon Halstead, they didn't know when or how Taylor died, and they initially didn't have enough evidence to get a search warrant for Robert Butler's house. So instead, they put surveillance on the house and the people cleaning it, hoping to find new leads. They found that there were two men in particular who were frequent visitors to Butler's home, 35-year-old Deontay Baker and 25-year-old Kieran Archer. Also, Baker's several girlfriends were the ones in charge of cleaning the house. Detectives started looking into the two men and the girlfriends and discovered they were all involved in some shady stuff. They tried triangulating the location of their cell phones, only to find that each of them carried 5 to 6 phones. By then, the case file kept getting bigger and bigger, and soon Butler's finances also came into question when they found he was writing very large checks to them. In the spring of 2017, the FBI was called into the case to investigate several drug and money laundering ties that later grew into a full separate case from Taylor's murder. Months went by and nothing seemed to be progressing regarding Taylor's case, only the drug bust. Her parents were growing frustrated. They believed that their daughter was never given a fair investigation due to corruption, money, and connections in the system. It would take almost a full year to the day when Taylor's body was found for the police to go back to question Robert Butler, as well as the other two suspects, Deontay Baker and Kieran Archer. And after they heard the suspects' statements, a story finally started to emerge about the events that took place the night of December 21st, 2016, and led to Taylor's body being found the following morning. Deontay said that he was out partying with Kieran Archer and another man named Desmond Washington when they received a call from a distraught Robert Butler telling them they needed to come to the house as soon as possible to take Taylor to the hospital. He stated that when they got there, they found Taylor in Butler's bed. She was groaning in pain and she was barely conscious. She was wearing only a t-shirt and had urinated on the bed. According to Butler, Taylor had been ill for a few days, but he thought it was just because she was going through withdrawal. However, her condition had gotten far worse that day. He said that he panicked when he saw that she was in a great deal of pain and called Deontay and the others to come take her to the hospital. Deontay said that after finding Taylor partially unconscious, he told Butler that they needed to call 911, but Butler refused because there were illegal drugs and firearms in the home. Being left with no other option, the men wrapped Taylor up in the bedsheet and loaded her into the back seat of Butler's truck, when they drove around supposedly looking for a hospital. However, when the police tried to track the route they had taken in order to come up with a timeline, they found that they'd passed multiple facilities that they could have provided Taylor with the help she needed. Deontay later said that they were worried about getting into trouble if they dropped her off at the hospital because she was a half-naked white woman and they were 3 black men. So instead, they wasted pivotal time just driving around aimlessly before they noticed that Taylor wasn't breathing anymore. They panicked and called Butler to inform him that Taylor had died in the truck. He told them they couldn't bring her body back to the house and they should just take care of it. The men spent time conspiring on how to get rid of the body. Baker admitted that at first they thought about burying her, but realized they were running out of time, so they just pulled over and dumped the body in an alley in a residential area in such a panic that they actually ran her over. Deontay claimed it was an accident. After they ditched the body, the men claimed that they returned to Butler's house to take it upon themselves to get rid of any evidence that would tie them to Taylor. Deontay called his girlfriends to come clean the house up, and they went to the store to get supplies to clean the truck with. Then they burned their clothes and destroyed the surveillance tapes at the home that would have shown them carrying Taylor's body out of the house. Butler also boxed up all of Taylor's belongings and burned them, including the sheets and mattress that she had slept on. Ironically, the process of destroying all the evidence actually took place after the police interviewed Butler at his house on December 22nd, so if they had actually attempted to obtain a search warrant, they would have found dozens of incriminating pieces of evidence. Butler had claimed he barely knew Taylor and he hadn't seen her in 8 days before she was murdered. He disputed that Taylor had lived in his house, despite multiple statements from friends of Taylor. Also, it's worth mentioning that in the autopsy report, the medical examiner stated finding white dog hair on Taylor's body as well as tape residue on her mouth and wrists, as if she'd been bound and gagged. Interestingly, Butler had a white dog, and the detective who visited him the day Taylor's body was found stated in his report that he had observed a roll of thick painter's tape on a table. When a search warrant was executed, law enforcement did find a couple of personal items belonging to Taylor in the home, which included her guitar and a monogrammed Bible. The items were returned to her parents. Items never found, and likely never would, are her purse and cell phone. Robert Butler, Deontay Baker, and Kieran Archer were only convicted of failure to report a death, which is a misdemeanor in the state of Florida. Butler was given a year, but only served 8 months. Baker was also given a year, while Archer was given 6 months and served only 4 for his cooperation. Desmond Washington was never charged, even though he was rumored to have been the one driving the truck that ran over Taylor's body. Additionally, none of the men were ever charged with tampering with evidence, a third-degree felony in Florida and is punishable up to 5 years in prison. Butler and Baker were also charged with money laundering in that separate case. In addition to that, Butler's list of charges included possession of marijuana and felony possession of ammunition. According to court records, Butler and Baker pleaded guilty to federal money laundering charges. Butler was sentenced to 40 months in prison and ordered to forfeit $140,000. Butler's sentence was later reduced to 27 months. He was released in 2021. After Butler pleaded guilty in court to the money laundering charges, Taylor's parents gave the kind of impact statement you should reserve for murder cases. They asked the judge to give him the maximum sentence and take him into custody the same day to ensure he missed Christmas with his family like their daughter did in 2016 and forever will. Leslie recalled how she had to wrap gifts for her other children and 2 granddaughters while at the same time make arrangements for Taylor's funeral. She said that no parent should ever have to see their child in a casket. The St. Petersburg Police Department labeled Taylor's murder as a cold case, and despite the mountain of evidence, they say they still don't know where or when or how Taylor died, who was responsible, and if there was an intent to kill in the first place. To charge somebody with murder, I've got to have evidence that the person committed the murder, Chief Assistant State's Attorney Bruce Bartlett said. He added, "There's a lot of suspicions, a lot of finger pointing, and I've got to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury down the road." To this day, Taylor's parents are still fighting and doing everything they can to bring truth of what happened to their daughter to light, and they say they will not rest until justice is served. They have filed several complaints about the SPPD's investigation, but were told that all complaints are handled internally, and they were basically told to stop bothering. Bill McAllister, Taylor's father, said, "She deserves justice for what was done to her. We deserve it. Her girls deserve it. Our family. Someone has to be held accountable, one way or another."
And she would say, "I love you, Daddy. I love you, Mommy. And I'm never going to have that again."
For this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this content and what I do over here, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss my next upload. As well, if you can give this video a like, that would be much appreciated as it helps the channel to grow. We also have channel membership or Patreon if you want to get more behind the scenes, support the channel, and get exclusive content. In the description box of this video, you will also find links to all my socials to connect with me as well as other goodies. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.